The floor of the hollow was still ringing when Warden 6 came up through the gate, and Cadet Rehin Voss was already counting its steps. 6, 7, 8. The gate was wrong, too careful for something that outweighed a ground car. Around him, 22 cadets fanned out across the sunken arena in a ragged crescent, boots scraping on stone worn pale by 3 centuries of trials, and not one of them seemed to notice that the beast wasn't looking at any of them at all. Proctor Dral Karas stood on the rimwalk above. 4 clawed hands folded behind a spine ridge armored the color of wet slate, and his voice came down through the collar translators clipped to every cadet's throat, flat and without inflection, the Kathir accent that always sounded like stone grinding on stone. No cadet stops until the auger stops moving. This is Trial 9. Trial 9 has never gone past 4 minutes without blood on the floor. Attack. Nobody moved for exactly as long as it took to be afraid, and then everybody moved at once. Rehin didn't. He stood at the edge of the crescent with his practice spear low across his body, weight on the balls of his feet, and watched the auger instead of the cadets rushing it. Warden 6 was 11 meters of ridged black chitin and coiled muscle, blind the way a thing that hunted by vibration and scent was blind, with a skull built low and wide like a wedge for driving through rock. Its forelimbs ended in claws the length of a man's forearm, curved for digging, not for the raking strikes the training manuals described. Everyone in the hollow had read the same manual. Everyone in the hollow was about to find out that the manual was written by people who had never actually stood in the dirt and watched one of these things think. It wasn't hunting, it was listening. The first cadet to reach it, a broad-shouldered Kathir named Avrik, 3 years ahead of Rehin and built like the arena wall itself, swung a training pike into the auger's foreleg with a crack that echoed off the tiered stone. The beast barely staggered. It didn't turn on him. It shouldered him aside the way a man might shove through a crowded doorway, not the way a predator dealt with prey, and kept moving toward the northeast quadrant of the floor, head low, claws already starting to bite into the stone in short, testing strokes. Avrik went down hard, cursed in 3 dialects, and 2 more cadets closed in to cover him. Rehin had been at Threndel Academy for 11 months, long enough to know that the hollow's floor was not, as the recruitment materials like to imply, simple stone the whole way down. Long enough to have heard the older cadets talk, in the low voices reserved for things instructors didn't want repeated, about the underring, the original trial vault that had sat beneath this exact arena floor before a support collapse killed 6 cadets during a live exercise 19 years ago, and how the academy had simply poured a new floor over the wreckage rather than clear it, because clearing it would have meant admitting the collapse had happened at all. He filed that memory away in the same part of his mind where he kept the sound the auger's claws were making against the stone, not the sound of claws hunting for purchase, the sound of claws hunting for a soft spot. Voss, Karas's voice again, closer this time. The proctor had come down 2 tiers, close enough that Rehin could see the old mold scars ridging his throat plates, a rank marker no different in function than the medals humans used to pin to a chest, except a Kathir couldn't lie about his. You are 11 months into this academy and you have not once led an engagement. Today you engage. Copy, Rehin said, and didn't move his eyes off the auger. Around him, the trial was already going wrong in the specific, ugly way trials went wrong when the thing being fought refused to fight the way the lesson plan expected. 2 more cadets went down, not maimed. The academy didn't run maiming trials, not officially, but heard enough that their collar lights flared amber and medical drones peeled off the ceiling gantries to collect them. The auger shrugged off strike after strike like a man brushing off rain, and every single one of those strikes was landing on a body that was, Rehin was now fairly certain, not actually trying to hurt anyone. It was trying to get past them. He looked for Priya Anand in the crescent and found her 4 positions to his left, sweat-slick and breathing hard, having just pulled a downed cadet clear of the auger's path with the kind of unglamorous, unrewarded competence that got human cadets exactly nowhere on the Academy's scoring boards. She caught his eye for half a second. He held up 2 fingers low out of Karas's sightline, the old signal from a different life, a different uniform, a different set of people trusting him with their spines. Hold. Watch. She held. Then he did the thing that would, in 4 minutes, get him formally cited for insubordination, and did not think about it as insubordination at all. He crossed toward the northeast quadrant, toward the spot the augur kept driving for, and got down on one knee. He pressed his palm flat against the stone. The floor of the hollow was quarried granite, load-bearing, rated, according to the same manuals that had gotten the gait of a digging predator wrong, to hold the weight of a full trial cohort plus heavy simulation gear. Rehin had spent 4 years before the Academy in the Combat Engineering Corps back on Earth, most of that time with his cheek against rubble listening for the specific, wrong resonance a structure made, when there was empty space beneath it that shouldn't be there. He'd pulled people out of 3 collapsed transit tunnels and 1 flooded mine shaft doing exactly what he was doing now, and his hand against Threndel Academy's arena floor told him, in about a second and a half, that the granite under his palm was ringing hollow. Not cracked, hollow, like a drum with something moving on the far side of the skin. "Karas," he said, and stood and didn't shout it because he had learned a long time ago that shouting made people listen less, not more. "Pull the trial. There's a void under quadrant northeast. The augur's not hunting the cadets. It's trying to reach whatever's under the floor." Karas's throat plates flared, the Kathir equivalent, Rehin had come to understand, of a raised eyebrow, though on a 400-pound proctor it read considerably less casual. "The underring has been sealed for 19 years, Cadet. There is nothing beneath that floor but old concrete and a decommissioning order." "Then the beast's chasing an old concrete smell awful hard," Rehin said. Somewhere behind him, on the tier above the rimwalk, a headcount drone finished its slow pass over the assembled cohort and quietly, without fanfare, without anyone watching the feed closely enough to notice yet, flagged 1 roster tag that had not checked in since the pre-trial formation 40 minutes earlier. "Cadet Soltar, status, unlocated." Nobody in the hollow knew that yet. The augur did. It threw itself at the northeast quadrant floor with both forelimbs at once, and the granite Rehin had just called hollow answered with a crack that every cadet in the arena felt through the soles of their boots. Karas did not pull the trial. Rehin understood why, even as he hated it. Trial 9 ran on a schedule set 2 tiers above the proctor's own rank, broadcast on a delay to 3 allied academies as part of a cooperative standards review, and a proctor who halted a live combat exercise on the word of an 11-month human transfer, based on nothing but a hand pressed to stone, was a proctor who would spend the next cycle explaining himself to people who did not forgive explanations. Karas's spine ridge stiffened instead. His voice, when it came back through the collars, had gone harder, not softer. "Cohort converge. The augur is compromising the arena floor. Kill order authorized, full lethal engagement, all units. End this before it brings the ceiling down." 21 cadets surged toward the northeast quadrant. Rehin stayed where he was, between the augur and the cadets closing on it, and understood with a cold, settling certainty that he was now standing in the one place in the hollow that nobody wanted him to be. "Vas, clear the line," Karas ordered. "There's someone under that floor," Rehin said. "Killing the one thing digging toward them isn't going to help whoever's down there breathe." That is an assumption built on a wall you touched for 2 seconds. It's an assumption built on 4 years pulling people out of collapsed rock, and a roster count somebody on your tier is about to run if they haven't already. Rehin didn't raise his voice. He'd learned that too, in tunnels dark enough that panic killed faster than debris. The calmer you sounded, the more people believed you had a plan, and believing that was half of actually having one. "Proctor, run the roster." For a moment Karas didn't move. 4 black eyes fixed on him with the particular stillness Cathier used instead of a glare. And then a Comtech 2 tears up, young, still soft-scaled, clearly grateful for an excuse to be doing something other than watching a training exercise fall apart, called down in a voice pitched too high for the moment. Proctor Cadet Flag, Tar Sol, unlocated since 0640, last catwalk transit logged at the Northeast Maintenance Grate. He's not answering his caller. The hollow went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet when a rumor becomes a fact. Sol Tar was the smallest cadet in the third-year intake, a hatchling cohort straggler whose carapace hadn't hardened on schedule the way a Cathier's was supposed to, soft-plated and pale along the seams where his cohort mates had gone the deep slate of adulthood. The other cadets called him half-shell, not always unkindly, but not kindly either, and Rehin had watched him, across 11 months of mess hall seating charts and formation lineups, learn to make himself smaller than he already was. He had also watched Cadet Dreathcall, 2 ranks above Sol and built like Avric's younger, meaner brother, take Sol's proof mark off his belt during morning drill 3 days ago, and toss it over the maintenance rail into the restricted catwalk above the sealed underring, the kind of casual cruelty that cost the victim a demerit for losing academy property and cost the thrower nothing at all, because nobody watched where a runt's belongings landed. Rehin hadn't seen where Sol had gone since. Nobody had, apparently, until a headcount drone noticed 40 minutes too late. Handler protocol, Rehin said, already moving, already thinking 3 steps past the confirmation he'd just gotten. Wardens are subterranean predators. If Sol went through a weak grate onto old flooring, and that flooring gave, then he is under 19 years of sealed concrete and a live combat trial, and the fastest way to reach him is through the wall the auger is already breaking, Karras finished, and something in the proctor's voice had changed, not softened. Cathier didn't soften but sharpened toward a different target. Cohort, belay lethal order, defensive perimeter only. Nobody touches the auger's forelimbs. It was the right call 4 minutes too late for the 21 cadets already mid-charge, most of whom had trained their whole lives to hear kill order and stop hearing anything else. Avric was already airborne, pike raised two-handed over the auger's blind, wedge-shaped skull muscle memory outrunning the new instruction by a full second, and Rehin did the only thing his own body gave him time to do. He put himself under the pike. Not between Avric and the beast. There wasn't time to be that clean about it, but close enough, fast enough, that his shoulder took the pike's haft instead of letting it land clean, and the strike that should have opened a wound along the auger's skull went wide and cracked against stone instead, hard enough that Rehin felt it in his teeth. Pain went up his arm in a bright, familiar line, an old injury from a collapsed transit tunnel waking up to remind him it had never fully healed, and he rode it down onto one knee instead of flat onto his back, because staying upright, even barely, was the difference between being trampled and merely being hurt. Voss, Avric started, more startled than angry, the pike still vibrating in his hands. He's not attacking anyone, Rehin said, breathing through the pain, looking up at 400 pounds of ridged black chitin that had gone very still above him, sensing a body it could have crushed and hadn't. Look at him. Look at what he's actually doing. The auger's head swung toward Rehin, not the sightless, questing motion it had used on every other cadet in the arena, but something with a different quality to it, a stillness that read, even on a face with no expression a human could parse, like attention. Its claws, still buried wrist-deep in the cracked granite of the northeast quadrant, went motionless. For 3 full seconds nothing in the hollow moved at all. 300 people on the tiers above holding a silence Rehin could feel on the back of his neck, and then the beast made a sound none of them had heard it make before, low, grinding, almost mournful, more vibration than voice, felt through the floor as much as heard through the collars, and went back to digging. Faster now. Like it had just been given permission, it didn't know it needed. Handler, Karas said into his own collar, voice pitched to carry up through the tiers to wherever the proctor's own chain of command sat watching the delayed broadcast feed. I need Warden Corps on the floor. Now. And get medical staged at the northeast grate. We have a possible entrapment beneath the arena surface. Live subject unconfirmed. Rehin got up. His shoulder screamed at him and he ignored it, because ignoring pain that wasn't disabling was a skill the Corps had drilled into him long before Threndel Academy had ever heard his name. And because there was a sound coming up through the crack the auger had just opened in the stone faint, warped by 19 years of dead air and dust, but unmistakably a voice. Small, young, frightened in the specific, exhausted way of someone who had been frightened for 40 minutes with nobody coming. Someone's there, Priya said, arriving at his shoulder, dust already streaking her collar. Rehin, someone's actually down there. Yeah, Rehin said, and knelt again at the crack, close enough now to feel cold air breathing up out of it, old and mineral and wrong against the warm daylight pumped down through the hollow's high glass ceiling. Soul, soul, can you hear me? The voice that came back up through 19 years of sealed dark was barely more than a whisper, but it was there, and it was answering, and that was the first genuinely good thing that had happened in the hollow all morning. I'm here, something's on top of me. I can't, a ragged breath, the sound of someone trying very hard not to make the sound of someone crying. Is that the auger? Is it coming down here? It's not coming to hurt you, Rehin said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he believed it completely. It's coming because you're the only thing in this whole arena it's actually been listening for. Behind him, on the 10-meter perimeter Karas had just ordered, Avrik stood with his cracked pike still in one fist, staring down at the widening crack with the particular stunned stillness of a cadet replaying, in fast and unwelcome detail, every strike he'd just landed on a creature that had never once meant to hurt him. He wasn't alone in it. Up and down the loose ring of cadets, the same recalculation was happening in real time. Bruised knuckles and torn practice gear, suddenly meaning something entirely different than they had 4 minutes ago, when landing a solid hit on the auger had still felt like winning. One of the younger cadets, a slight, anxious third year named Yeska, who had spent most of the trial hanging back from the worst of the fighting, broke from the perimeter without waiting for an order and started forward toward the crack with her bare hands already reaching, some instinct toward help outrunning any actual plan for how to use it. Stop, Rehin said, sharp enough to carry, not unkind but immediate. Don't touch the edge. You'll bring loose stone down into the gap before we've got it stabilized. Yeska froze mid-stride, chastened, and looked at him with the wide, uncertain eyes of a cadet who had wanted badly to be useful, and had just learned that wanting to help wasn't the same skill as knowing how. He sounded so. I know, Rehin said, gentler now. Best way to help him is standing right where you are and keeping this floor clear until we know what we're actually dealing with. That's not nothing. That's the job too. She nodded, swallowed hard, and held the perimeter, and Rehin filed the moment away without dwelling on it. One more cadet learning, the hard and immediate way, the difference between a trial built to reward speed and a crisis that rewarded exactly the opposite. The auger didn't stop at the sound of Soul's voice. If anything, it dug harder, claws throwing up chips of granite in a widening arc, and Karas's next order cut through the murmuring tiers like a blade. Back the cohort off, full clearance 10 meters minimum, let it work. Nobody argued. 21 cadets who 4 minutes earlier had been ordered to kill the thing now stood in a loose ring and watched it dig, and the quality of the silence in the hollow had changed entirely. Not the silence of an audience waiting for violence, but the silence of people who had just watched the ground under their own boots turn out to be a lie. Rehin didn't back off 10 meters. He stayed at the lip of the crack, one hand still flat against the stone, feeling the vibration pattern change as the auger worked, and when Karas's shadow fell over him a second time he didn't look up. You are not cleared to remain on that line, Cadet. With respect, Proctor, I'm the only one on this floor who's done this before. Rehin said it without heat, the same flat register he'd have used reporting a supply count. Not the digging, the listening. I need you to trust that for about 90 more seconds, because if the auger breaks through wrong, that entrapment becomes a burial, and I would rather explain insubordination to your review board than explain that to whoever's waiting for Sol at home. Karas's throat plates did something complicated, flare, settle, flare again. The closest thing to a species without human facial muscles had to a man chewing on a decision he didn't like. Above them, on the rimwalk, the delayed broadcast feed had gone from routine trial footage to something the three allied academies watching it were very much not going to forget. And Rehin understood, in the part of his mind that never fully stopped calculating angles even in a crisis, that this fact alone was probably buying him more patience than his rank technically deserved. 90 seconds, Karas said. Then you clear the line and let handling protocol take over. Copy. The crack the auger had opened was narrow, maybe 40 centimeters at its widest, jagged-edged, breathing that cold mineral air up out of the dark in slow pulses that told him the space below wasn't sealed as tight as everyone assumed, which was good, because it meant Sol wasn't suffocating, and bad, because it meant the undering's old structure had already been failing quietly for years before a scared young cadet's weight had finally proven it. He pressed his ear near the gap, listening past the grinding of claws to the smaller sound underneath it, the labored breathing of someone pinned. Sol, talk to me. What's on top of you? A beam. I think it's a support beam. It's old. It's got dust all over it. I couldn't see. It was dark and I fell, and then everything came down and the voice cracked, steadied, cracked again. 14 years old by Cathir reckoning, which put him somewhere near a human 16, and doing a better job holding together than most adults would have managed. My left arm stuck under it. I can move my legs. I don't think anything's broken except maybe my arm. That's good. That's really good, Sol. That's more than I was hoping for. Rehin kept his voice level, kept it warm, the exact tone he'd used a lifetime ago with a woman trapped under a collapsed pedestrian bridge who needed to believe someone competent had her, right up until the moment competence actually arrived. The beam, is it resting on you, or is something else holding the weight? A pause, the sound of someone shifting, wincing. I can feel something under it, like it's braced on something else. It's not crushing me, it's just I can't pull free. Which meant the beam was load-bearing for something above it, Rehin thought, doing the math fast and grim. Meant that if the auger tore through the ceiling of that space with the blunt enthusiasm it had been using on solid granite, the beam wouldn't just lift off Sol's arm, it would drop, and take whatever weight it was currently carrying down with it. Karas. He stood, turned, found the proctor already watching him with the stillness of someone who'd reached the same unhappy arithmetic half a second behind him. The auger can't finish this the way it's going. It'll bring the roof down on him the second it breaks through clean. We need it to widen the approach, not punch straight through. The auger digs the way the auger digs, Cadet. It is not a machine you can retask with a training command. No, said a new voice, dry and precise, threaded through with an accent that ran higher and lighter than the Cathir cadence. But it can be retasked with the right handler, which is, I believe, why someone finally called me. Handler Asenkor came down the tier stairs at a pace that made it clear she had been running before she reached the visible part of them, though nothing about her bearing now showed it. She was Vihin, narrow-boned, four-limbed with a second, smaller pair folded close against a torso plated in overlapping bronze-green scales. A crest of stiff feather analogues laid flat along her skull in a way Rehin had learned, from the two Vihin instructors on staff, meant focus rather than calm. She was old by any species reckoning, her crest gone silver-white at the edges, and she crossed the last meters to the crack without sparing the assembled cohort so much as a glance, dropping to one knee at the gap the way a woman half her visible age might have. "Warden 6, she said, not to Karas, not to Rehin, but down into the dark, in a low warbling register that the collar translators struggled to render into anything but a rough approximation. "Warden 6. Ease." The augur's claws stilled mid-stroke. It didn't stop digging entirely. Rehin watched it settle instead, forelimbs drawing back to a shallower angle, the frantic, single-minded violence of the last several minutes softening into something more careful, more surgical, the change as visible as a hand loosening its grip. Handler Core laid her own palm flat on the stone beside the beast's foreclaw, and for a moment the two of them, ancient predator and older handler, seemed to be listening to the same thing at once. "They don't teach you this in the trial manuals," she said, without looking up, apparently to Rehin, since he was the only cadet who hadn't retreated to the 10-meter line. "Because the manuals were written by people who wanted a weapon and didn't want the history that came with it. Deep wardens weren't bred for the hollow, Cadet. They were bred 4 centuries ago to work quake sites, to find the living under rubble by scent and pulse when no handler could get close enough to listen themselves. The military program that turned them into trial predators kept the instinct and buried the purpose, because a beast that runs toward danger on command is useful, and a beast that runs toward danger for a reason you can't order it to ignore is a liability." She glanced up at last, dark eyes unreadable in a face built for reading currents of air, not human expression. "Warden 6 has been trying to save someone since the moment it went through that gate. Every cadet in this arena mistook that for an attack." "Every cadet in this arena except him," Karas said, and it was the first time in 11 months Rehin had heard the proctor say something that sounded less like a rebuke and more like an admission. Handler Core's gaze moved to Rehin with new interest. "You read the gate." "I read the digging," Rehin said. "Gate told me it wasn't hunting anyone in the ring. The digging told me it wasn't random. Everything after that was just listening to the floor instead of the fight." "That's not a cadet's training," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No, ma'am, it isn't." She held his eyes a moment longer, some private calculation resolving behind them, and then turned back to the crack, all business again. "I can talk him through a controlled dig, narrow the aperture, brace as he goes, keep the load off whatever's holding that beam. But I need hands on the surface who won't panic when the ground under them starts moving, and I need someone small enough to go down into a gap this size the moment it's wide enough, because I am not, and Warden 6 is considerably less so." She looked at Rehin again, then past him at the cluster of cadets still holding the 10-meter perimeter, several of them, Avrik among them, watching with expressions that had gone from bloodlust to something closer to shame. "Volunteers." "Me," Rehin said, before anyone else had finished drawing breath. "You're injured," Priya said quietly, at his elbow, nodding at the shoulder he still hadn't let himself favor. "I've gone into worse holes with worse arms," he said, which was true and did not make the shoulder hurt any less. "Handler, I've done confined space extraction, real ones, not simulator time. I know how to move around a load-bearing member without shifting it, and I know how to keep someone talking who's scared enough to stop breathing right." He glanced at Karas. "Proctor, I need you to override the trial broadcast delay and get this off the review feed until we've got him out. And I need everyone who isn't Handler Core, Cadet Anand, or me off this floor, because right now the biggest structural risk in that hole isn't the auger. It's 22 nervous cadets deciding to help." For a long moment nobody moved, the entire tiered bowl of the hollow holding its breath around the widening dark crack in its own floor. 3 allied academies watching a delayed feed that Karas had not, in fact, managed to kill yet. A proctor weighing 11 months of a human cadet's quiet, unremarkable service against the sudden, total certainty in that same cadet's voice. Then Karas turned toward the tiers and gave the order that would, within the hour, become the thing every cadet at Threndel Academy remembered about Trial 9 long after they'd forgotten who won it. "Clear the floor, Voss has command of the extraction. The cohort didn't leave quietly. Nobody at Threndel Academy left anything quietly, least of all a training floor mid-collapse with a rescue riding on it. But the tiers cleared in under 90 seconds all the same. Drones and medical staff, and 24 cadets funneling up through the exit arches while Karas's voice cracked through the collars like a whip. And by the time the last of them cleared the rim, the only figures left on the floor of the hollow were Rihin, Priya, Handler Core, Warden 6, and the widening dark seam in the granite that held Sol Tar. "Talk to me while you rig," Core said, already unspooling a coil of gray cable from a pack Rihin hadn't noticed she was carrying, dense and fine-woven, nothing like the coarse tow line the Academy issued for training drills. "What's your read on the space below?" "Old vault based on what he's described. Support beam pinning his left arm, not his weight. Something else is riding on that beam, so if it lifts wrong, whatever's above it comes down." Rihin crouched at the crack, running his palm along its ragged edge, feeling for the grain of the stone the way he'd once felt for the grain of collapsed rebar. "The gap's too narrow to see anything. I need it wide enough for a body, no wider, and I need it opened from the top down so we're not undermining the floor she's standing on." He nodded at Priya without looking up. "I need someone on the surface managing the line and talking to me the whole way, because calm through solid granite is going to be garbage the second I'm 3 meters down." "That's me," Priya said, already crouched beside the pack Core had brought, checking buckles with the brisk, unhurried competence of someone who had spent the last 11 months quietly deciding. She trusted this particular human's instructions more than most of the Academy's official protocol. "Go." Handler Core laid her palm flat against Warden 6's foreclaw again, murmuring in that low, warbling register, and the beast, 11 meters of a creature that 4 minutes earlier had been under a lethal kill order, folded itself down at the edge of the crack with something disturbingly close to patience. Its claws found the ragged stone edge and began drawing outward instead of down, widening the aperture in slow, deliberate strokes. Each one paused, each one listened to. The gap grew, 40 centimeters, 60, a jagged crown of broken granite peeling back from a darkness that smelled, when it finally breathed wide enough for Rihin to lean over it, of old dust and cold metal and something faintly, unpleasantly organic that he decided not to think too hard about yet. "Sol," he kept his voice pitched down into the gap, warm and level. "We're widening it. Might get loud for a second. I need you to keep your good arm over your head, okay? Protect your skull. Everything else we can fix." "Okay," a small cracked sound that was trying very hard to be steady. "Okay. Is the auger still?" "It's the one doing the digging," Rihin said. "It's the reason we found you at all. When you get out of here, you're going to owe it a better nickname than the auger." A sound came up through the crack that might, under better circumstances, have been a laugh. The gap reached 90 centimeters and Warden 6 drew back on its own, without command, the way a machine finishing a calibrated cut might power down at the exact right threshold, and Handler Core made a low sound of approval and reached for the cable Priya had finished checking. That was when the voice came through Karas's collar loud enough that everyone on the floor heard it. "Proctor Karas. This is Overseer Dranth Vel, Regional Command." The new voice carried none of Karas's grinding cadence, smoother, colder, the voice of someone speaking from a comfortable office a great distance from any actual crack in any actual floor. "You have run a live broadcast combat trial 40 minutes past scheduled completion, halted lethal engagement against direct order, and ceded operational command of Academy property to an 11-month human transfer cadet. Explain in one sentence why I should not end your posting today." Karas's throat plates had gone rigid, a stillness that read, even to a human 11 months into learning to read Kathir body language, as something close to fury held on a very short leash. "Overseer, there is a live entrapment beneath the arena floor. A third-year cadet, conscious, pinned, currently being extracted." then hand extraction to certified rescue personnel, and resume the trial on the secondary floor. The broadcast partners are asking why Trial 9 has gone dark for 6 minutes. There are no certified rescue personnel within 40 minutes of this facility, Overseer. There is a warden handler, 2 human cadets, and a beast whose instincts are, at this moment, considerably more reliable than the protocol you're quoting at me. Karas's voice hadn't risen, hadn't softened, but something in it had gone flat and final in a way Rihan hadn't heard from the proctor in 11 months of drills. Kill the broadcast if the partners are uncomfortable watching an academy save a cadet's life, instead of scripting his death for their feed. I am not resuming lethal engagement, and I am not pulling Cadet Voss off this line. There was a silence on the other end of the comm that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. Understood, Overseer Vell said, in a tone that promised the conversation was not, in fact, over, merely postponed to a room with fewer witnesses. This will be reviewed. It always is, Karas said, and closed the channel himself, which Rihan understood from the sharp, startled glance Priya threw across the floor, was not a thing junior proctors were generally permitted to do to regional overseers. Rihan didn't have time to feel grateful yet. He'd file it later, the way he filed everything that mattered and couldn't be dealt with in the moment, the shoulder, the overseer, the particular look Karas had worn giving that order, and for now he clipped the last buckle of Kor's harness across his chest, tested the cable's give with 2 sharp tugs, and knelt at the lip of the crack. That was when Dreeth Call came back onto the floor. He shouldn't have been there, the tiers were cleared, the arches sealed to anyone below command rank. But Dreeth had the build and the bearing of a cadet who had never in his life believed a rule applied to him personally, and he came down the emergency stair 2 steps at a time with his belt mark still hanging loose, where he'd clearly torn it free of formation in a hurry, face drained the pale gray-green Cathier when instead of white. "It's my fault," he said, before anyone could order him back up, the words coming out of him in a rush like something that had been held under pressure for 40 minutes and had finally cracked. "The maintenance grate, I took his proof mark during drill. I threw it over the rail onto the old catwalk to watch him chase it. I didn't think nobody's supposed to be able to fall through. The grate's rated. It's rated for full cadet weight, I didn't think." "Not now," Rihan said, not unkindly, already lowering himself over the lip of the crack, boots finding a jagged first foothold in stone that had been sealed dark for 19 years. "You want to help him. You keep this floor clear, and you let Cadet Annan run the line without anyone else's noise in her ear. Everything else waits until he's standing on solid ground again." Dreeth's jaw worked, some argument or apology dying half-formed, and then he simply nodded and stepped back. And for the first time in 11 months Rihan saw him look like exactly what he was, a scared kid who had done something cruel and small, and was now watching the actual size of the world it had opened underneath someone else. "Cable's live," Priya said, voice steady, professional, exactly what Rihan needed it to be. "I've got you. Talk to me the whole way down." "Copy," Rihan said, and let the dark swallow him. The dark past the crack was colder than the arena above by a wide enough margin that Rihan felt it through his collar seam before his boots found the next foothold, and it carried a smell he recognized from 3 separate collapse sites back on Earth. Old dust gone stale in a sealed space, cold metal, and underneath it, faint and mineral, the smell of something that had been broken a long time ago and never properly mourned. His headlamp caught the first few meters of the underring in hard white relief. Broken support columns, sheared clean at odd angles, the kind of fracture pattern that told an engineer's eye a structure had failed all at once rather than settled slow. A section of curved wall, once probably painted some academy color long faded to gray, still bore the ghost of stenciled lettering, a trial designation, a date, numbers that put the marking at 19 years old almost to the season. Scattered across the vault floor below him, half buried in decades of settled grit, were things that had clearly once belonged to people. A cracked training helm, a boot sole gone stiff and curled, a strap of webbing that might have been a harness once. Rehin didn't let his light linger on any of it longer than a second. Some things you cataloged and moved past, because dwelling on them in the middle of a live extraction helped exactly nobody who was still breathing. "Talk to me," Priya said in his ear, cable paying out smooth and even above him. "I'm in." Old vault collapse, damage everywhere, looks like it happened fast and total. I've got 6-7 meters of clearance before the floor levels out. He kept descending, boots finding purchase where the old wreckage offered it, one hand steady on the cable, the other sweeping his light in slow arcs. This was the accident site. 19 years and nobody ever came back down to clear it. They just poured a new floor on top and called it sealed. "That's Academy for you," Priya said. And there was an edge under the dryness that told Rehin she was thinking the same thing he was. That somewhere under this rubble were the remains of 6 cadets, whose families had probably been told a version of events that didn't involve leaving them here. Not his problem to solve today. Today's problem had a name and a voice, and was getting closer with every meter. "Soul, I'm in. I can hear you breathing, you're doing good, just keep talking to me so I can find you faster than my light can." Here, the voice came from off to his left, weak but clearer now, no longer muffled by a full arena's worth of granite between them. "I can see a light. I can see your light." Rehin swung his beam and found him. Sol Tar was smaller than Rehin remembered from the mess hall, folded into a gap between 2 collapsed support sections, with a heavy composite beam angled across his left forearm. His pale, unhardened carapace gray with dust, one eye swollen half shut where something had struck him on the way down. He was conscious, alert, his free hand braced against the beam in the reflexive, useless way of someone who had been trying to lift it for 40 minutes with nothing left to lift with. And when the light hit him, his whole small body seemed to fold inward with relief so total it looked, for a second, almost like pain. "You came," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice, the disbelief buried in 2 simple words, told Rehin more about 11-year-old Sol Tar's expectations of this academy than a semester of overheard mess hall cruelty ever had. "Course I came." Rehin got a foothold on the collapsed section beside him and crouched close, running his light over the beam without touching it yet, cataloging angles, load points, the specific geometry of the thing that had to come off Sol's arm without bringing anything else down with it. "You did everything right. You kept your head, you kept breathing, you kept talking to me. That's most of the job done before I even got here." "My arm's gone numb." "Is that bad?" "It's not great, but it's not the worst thing that beam could have done to you, and we're going to fix it in the next few minutes." Rehin traced the beam's length with his light to where it disappeared into a tangle of collapsed shelving on the far side, old storage racking, he guessed, from whatever this vault had been used for before it became a tomb nobody admitted to having. The beam was doing exactly what Sol had described, not resting its full weight on his arm, but braced across it at an angle, pinned at the far end by the weight of the collapsed racking, which meant lifting the near end without first stabilizing the far end would send the whole assembly sliding, and Sol's arm with it. "Core, you copying this?" Rehin said into his collar. "Reading your headlamp feed," the handler's voice came back, threaded with the particular calm of someone who had spent decades listening to worse situations than this one. "I see the load point. You need the far end braced before you lift." "That's what I'm reading too. I don't have a jack down here." "You have a warden with claws built for exactly this kind of work, and a proctor topside who owes this extraction his job. Give me 30 seconds. Above him, faint through meters of rubble and one open crack, Rehin heard Karas's voice giving an order, and a moment later felt it more than heard it. A slow, deliberate vibration moving through the wreckage, Warden Six's claws finding the collapsed racking from above and beginning, with the same careful patience it had shown widening the crack, to draw the weight off the far end of the beam a few centimeters at a time. Talk to me the second anything shifts, Rihin told Soul, both hands now braced against the near end of the beam, testing its give without committing his full weight yet. I can feel it moving, not on me. The other end. Soul's breath had gone quick and shallow, fear finally breaking through the exhausted calm he'd been running on for 40 minutes, and Rihin recognized the sound of someone right at the edge of losing the thin thread of composure that had kept them alive this long. Look at me, not the beam, me. Rihin held the boy's eyes, steady, unhurried, the exact voice he'd used at the bottom of a flooded mine shaft with a woman who'd stopped believing rescue was coming 3 hours before it arrived. You've held this together for 40 minutes in the dark, alone, with a beast tearing up the ceiling above you and no idea if anyone was even looking. That's not luck. That's nerve. You've got more of it than most cadets twice your size, and you're about 30 seconds from not needing it anymore. So hold it a little longer. Can you do that? Soul's jaw was shaking, but he nodded and didn't look away. Far end's clear, Kor's voice came through, tight with concentration. Lift now, steady, don't jerk it. Rihin set his shoulder, the bad one, because it was the one closest to the angle he needed, and there was no time to be precious about it, and lifted. The beam came up slow, groaning against its own weight, dust sifting down from somewhere above in a fine gray curtain, and for one long, ugly second Rihin felt the whole assembly threaten to shift wrong, felt the specific sick lurch in his gut that meant everything was about to go from difficult to catastrophic in the space of half a heartbeat. And then it settled, the racking on the far end finding new purchase under Warden 6's guided claws. And the beam cleared Soul's arm by 10 centimeters of empty, blessed air. Move, Rihin said, and Soul moved, dragging himself sideways out from under the beam with his good arm and both legs, the numbed left arm hanging at an angle that made Rihin's jaw tighten even as he kept his voice level. And the second the boy was clear, Rihin let the beam back down slow and controlled instead of dropping it, because a controlled release was the difference between a contained collapse and a second one. Got him, Rihin said into his collar, already running his hands along Soul's arm with the quick, methodical touch of someone checking for the specific things that mattered right now: circulation, obvious fracture, anything that would get worse before they reached the surface. Arms cold, no open wound. I think it's a clean fracture below the elbow. He's talking, he's alert. He's a lot tougher than this academy's given him credit for. Priya, get the recovery line ready, I'm bringing him up first, then coming up myself. Copy that, Priya said, and Rihin heard, underneath the professional clip of her voice, something that sounded a great deal like relief held very carefully in check. Soul's good hand found Rihin's sleeve and gripped it, hard, the grip of someone who had spent 40 minutes alone in the dark convincing himself no one was coming, and had not yet fully caught up to the fact that someone had. The auger, he said, it really wasn't trying to hurt me. No, Rihin said, working the recovery harness around the boy's narrow shoulders with careful, practiced hands, mindful of the fractured arm. It was the only thing in that whole arena that heard you the first time you called for help. Everybody else needed a human with his ear on the floor to translate. Above them, faint through the widened crack, framed by a rectangle of daylight that must have looked, to a 14-year-old who'd spent 40 minutes certain he'd die in the dark, like the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, Warden 6's low, grinding, mournful sound came again. And this time, Rihin thought, listening to it with the same ear he'd used to hear a trapped voice under a granite floor, it didn't sound mournful at all. It sounded like relief. Priya took Soul up slow and steady, the recovery line paying out in even, practiced pulls, and Rihin stood in the widening pool of daylight at the base of the shaft and watched the boy's small silhouette rise through 19 years of dark toward an arena full of cadets who, whatever else they thought of him tomorrow, would never again be able to call him half-shell without every one of them remembering exactly who had held together longest today. He should have gone up right behind him. That had been the plan, Soul first, Rihin second, out clean before the vault had time to reconsider its own structural opinions. He'd even turned toward the shaft, one hand already finding the cable Priya had dropped back down for him, when the sound reached him. A low, deep groan traveling through stone that Rehin's body understood a full second before his mind finished translating it, the specific bone-deep wrongness of a structure deciding all at once that it had held on long enough. Rehin Priya's voice, sharp in his ear, cable going taut. "Secondary collapse," he said, already moving, already calculating the geometry of a vault that had just spent 19 years balanced on the exact configuration his extraction had disturbed. The racking on the far side, pulling it clear, took the load off something else. "Core, tell me what's above me." "Old support column, offline the same night as everything else in there. Get clear of the center of the chamber now." He didn't need telling twice. He threw himself sideways, away from the shaft of daylight and toward the broken lip of a collapsed wall, and the ceiling of the old vault answered a half-second later with a fall of debris that would have caught him square if he'd stayed where the cable wanted him. A curtain of dust and broken composite crashing down exactly where he'd been standing, burying the shaft's base under enough rubble that the daylight above narrowed to a thin gray seam, and then, for one long, ugly moment, disappeared altogether. Rehin, Priya's voice, no longer professional calm, raw with something closer to fear than he'd heard from her in 11 months. "Here," he coughed dust out of his throat, ran a hand over himself in the dark by feel, nothing broken, nothing that felt worse than the shoulder he'd already been favoring, which was, he thought with the distant, clinical part of his mind that always kept working even when the rest of him was busy being buried, about the only piece of good news available at the moment. "I'm clear of the fall. I'm boxed in, though. Shafts collapsed behind me." He heard Karas's voice cut in, no longer flat, no longer distant Proctor calm, something in it that a human ear could have mistaken for genuine alarm. "Voss, report your position." "Alive," Rehin said, and found, even now, that he could say it dry enough to make Priya's next breath come out half a laugh, half a sob. "Give me a second to find out how big a problem I actually am." His light, still clipped to his collar, miraculously unbroken, showed him a chamber roughly 4 meters across, walls of old broken stone and the sheared stubs of collapsed columns, no visible way back to the shaft he'd come down through, and half buried under decades of settled grit along the far wall, 6 low shapes laid in a careful, deliberate row that had nothing to do with the chaos of the original collapse and everything to do with someone once taking the time to arrange them with dignity before the vault was sealed, and the truth of what had happened here was quietly poured over with new granite. He didn't need to check to know what they were. He kept his light on them for exactly as long as it took to be certain, and no longer, because there was nothing he could do for the 6 cadets who died here 19 years ago except make sure the 7th one, the living one, the one still breathing above him in an arena full of people who now knew something they hadn't known an hour ago, didn't end up laid alongside them. "I've got a secondary chamber," he reported, keeping his voice level, filing the row of shapes into the part of his mind that would need to deal with it later, not now. "No shaft access from here. I'm going to need a new dig point, and I've got a ceiling up there that already proved it doesn't like being disturbed, so whoever's coming for me needs to come slow." "Warden 6 is already reading your position," Core's voice came back, tight, focused. "He's got the vibration signature. I need you to find solid cover and stay still. Let him work around you instead of toward you. This is exactly the kind of extraction he was bred for, Cadet. Trust the animal." Rehin found a stretch of collapsed column thick enough to shelter behind and pressed himself against it. And above him, muffled by meters of rubble but unmistakable, he felt the auger begin to dig again. Not the frantic, single-minded urgency of the first attempt, but something older and steadier now. A creature that had spent 4 centuries of selective breeding learning exactly how to move toward a trapped, living pulse without bringing the world down on top of it twice. It took 11 minutes. Rihin counted every one of them, not out of fear. He'd done worse weights in worse holes, and there was a particular, hard-won calm that came from knowing you'd done everything right and the rest was simply time. But because counting kept his mind from drifting toward the 6 shapes laid against the far wall, toward the particular cruelty of an institution that had chosen new granite over old grief, and toward the small, cold anger that had started building in him the moment he'd understood exactly what 19 years of silence had cost. When the new gap finally opened above him, wide and clean and full of gray daylight, it wasn't Warden Six's claws that reached down through it first. It was Karas's own hand, four-clawed and slate-colored and steadier than Rihin had ever seen it, closing around his forearm and hauling him up the last meter with a strength that belonged to a proctor who had, at some point in the last hour, stopped treating this as a training incident and started treating it as something else entirely. Rihin came up into the hollow's daylight streaked gray with dust, shoulders screaming, both knees scraped raw, and found the entire cleared floor of the arena watching him in a silence that had nothing performative left in it at all, Priya white-faced at the shaft's edge, Sol propped against a medical drone support frame with his splinted arm, and his good eye fixed on Rihin like he was checking a fact he still didn't quite believe, Handler Core with one hand still resting against Warden Six's foreclaw, and above them all on the rimwalk, 300 cadets from an audience that had been ordered cleared and had, Rihin would learn later, refused every single order to actually leave. "There are 6 cadets in that vault," Rihin said, before anyone could ask him anything else, before the moment could tip toward relief and away from the thing he needed said out loud while it was still burning in his chest. "Laid out deliberate, not scattered. Somebody came down here 19 years ago after the collapse and took the time to arrange them with respect before this place got sealed and forgotten. I want to know who that was. And I want to know why this academy decided pouring new stone over them was easier than telling their families the truth." Nobody answered him for a long moment. Karas's throat plates had gone very still, and when the proctor finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Rihin hadn't heard in it before, not command, not correction, but something closer to an old debt finally coming due. "Because I was the cadet who arranged them," Karas said, "and I have spent 19 years waiting for someone to ask." The hollow held its silence a moment longer, 300 cadets on the tiers above suddenly very aware they were listening to something none of them had been meant to hear. And then Karas did something Rihin had never once seen a Kathir proctor do in 11 months at Threndel Academy. He sat down. Not knelt, not crouched in the economical way the species used for close work, sat, heavily, on the broken lip of the shaft, 400 pounds of armored authority folding down into something considerably smaller. "I was a third-year cadet the night of the first collapse," he said, and his voice had lost the grinding stone flatness entirely now, replaced by something worn thin at the edges from 19 years of carrying it alone. Trial 9 ran differently than deeper structure, older support architecture, a vault 2 levels down instead of 1, and a proctor who believed the fastest way to build a cadet's nerve was to run trials with the lights cut and no safety margin at all. 6 of my cohort were in that vault when the ceiling came down. I was the only one close enough to the exit to get clear. "You went back in," Rihin said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the row of shapes, arranged with a care that didn't belong to panic or to indifference. He'd known, somewhere in the part of his mind that had spent the last hour reading structures and instincts instead of words, that whoever had done that had paid for it. "I went back in," Karas agreed. "Found all 6, could save none of them, the collapse had taken them fast before I ever reached the exit myself, so I did the only thing left that felt like it mattered. I laid them where the dust wouldn't reach them first and I came out and I reported exactly what I'd seen." His throat plates flared, settled, flared again, the old gesture, but slower now, heavier. The Academy's response was to convene a closed review, rule the vault structurally unsound, and pour a new floor over it inside of 6 months. No inquiry into the training protocol that put third years in a collapsing structure with the lights out. No notification to the 6 families beyond a standard casualty report that named the cause as training accident, location classified. I was offered a choice between silence and expulsion for insubordination, because I would not stop asking why the review had taken 6 days and produced no names beyond the dead. I chose silence. He looked up, and for the first time Rehan saw something in a Kathir face he could read without needing 11 months of practice to translate it: plain, unhidden shame. I told myself I chose it so I could stay close enough to eventually change something. 19 years, and the only thing I ever managed to change was making sure Trial 9's kill order got called a fraction slower than it used to. Today, a cadet with 11 months seniority and a hand pressed to stone did more in 4 minutes than I did in 19 years. Nobody on the floor spoke. Somewhere above, a medical drone's soft hum was the only sound in the whole tiered bowl of the hollow, and Rehan, dust-streaked, bleeding lightly from one scraped knee, standing on the exact spot where 6 cadets had died, and one proctor's silence had been bought with a threat, found that the anger he'd been carrying since he'd seen those 6 shapes had nowhere left to go except somewhere useful. "Then help me change the rest of it," he said. "Not for me, for him." He nodded at Soul, still propped against the medical drone's frame, listening with the wide, unblinking stillness of a cadet learning in real time that the world he'd spent 3 years being mocked in had more cracks in it than the ones under the arena floor. And for whoever's cadet number 7, in some future cohort, standing at the edge of a trial they don't yet know is broken. Karas was quiet for a long moment. Then he rose, slow, the weight of 19 years visibly different on him now than it had been an hour ago, and turned to face the tiers still crowded with cadets who had refused every order to clear. "Trial 9 is suspended pending full structural review," he said, and his voice had found its authority again, but it carried a different register now. One Rehan hadn't heard from him before, not command for its own sake, but command finally aimed at something worth commanding. "The undering will be opened, cleared, and its dead returned to their families with full honors and a true account of how they died. Effective today." Applause was not a thing Kathir culture practiced. What happened instead, from 300 cadets on the tiers above, was a low, resonant hum that Rehan felt through the soles of his boots. The sound, he would learn later from Priya, that a Kathir cohort made when it recognized something true had finally been said out loud, and it rolled through the hollow for a long, unbroken minute while medical drones finished their work, and Handler Corps stood with one hand still resting, unhurried, against the flank of a beast that had spent 4 centuries being asked to forget what it was actually for. Medical cleared Rehan an hour later with 4 cracked ribs he hadn't noticed acquiring somewhere between the pike strike and the collapsed ceiling, a shoulder that would need 3 weeks in a brace, and a flat, unimpressed stare from the Kathir field medic who told him, in the clipped tone of someone who had clearly treated a great many stubborn cadets, that he was not to so much as lift a training pike until the brace came off. He signed the discharge form, one-handed, and went looking for Soul before he'd finished reading it. He found him in the recovery ward 2 levels down, splinted arm resting on a support pillow, the swelling around his eye already fading under a cold compress patch, and Dreeth Call sitting in the chair beside the bed with the particular hunched posture of someone who had been there a while and did not expect to be welcomed. "He wanted to leave when I got here," Dreeth said, not looking up. "I told him I wasn't going until he threw me out himself. Figured that was fair, since I'm the reason he had a reason to." "He's still here," Rehan said. "He's still here," Dreeth agreed, and something in his voice suggested this fact currently mattered to him more than almost anything else in his life. He looked up at Rehan, jaw tight. "I filed a full report. Not the version that makes me look like I tripped over the mark by accident. The real one. Proctor Karas has it, and so does the review board." "Good," Rehan said, and meant it, and didn't offer him absolution he wasn't in a position to give, because that wasn't his to hand out. It belonged to the boy in the bed, if and when he decided he wanted to. Sol's good eye tracked between them, and for a moment he looked younger than 14 by Kathy reckoning, younger than the mess hall version of him that had learned to fold himself small. "I'm not ready to say it's fine," he said, to Dreeth, careful and precise, like he'd been rehearsing the sentence in his head for the better part of an hour. "But I don't want you standing there like you're waiting for me to hit you either. Sit down properly or go home." Dreeth sat down properly. Rihin left them to it and found Priya in the corridor outside, arms crossed, watching a wall-mounted feed screen with an expression that told him something had shifted since he'd last checked in with the actual world above ground. "You're going to want to see this," she said, and turned the volume up. The screen showed a recording, not the official Academy feed, which Karas had, in fact, managed to kill inside of 6 minutes of the trial going sideways, but a secondary capture from one of the 3 allied academies watching the original broadcast, who had apparently kept recording long after their own feed officially cut, and had spent the last 2 hours quietly circulating a 9-minute clip across every training network in the region. It showed the crack opening in the arena floor. It showed a human cadet on his knees with his palm against granite, calling a halt to a kill order 2 tiers above his rank. It showed Handler Corps' hands on Warden 6's foreclaw, and a proctor's voice refusing a regional overseer on an open channel. And at the very end, a 14-year-old cadet coming up out of the dark on a recovery line with his splinted arm cradled against his chest, and his one good eye fixed, unblinking on the daylight. "It's got 400,000 views," Priya said, "in 2 hours, on a network that normally gets excited about a training drill upset." "That's not going to make the review board happy," Rihin said. "No," she agreed. "But it's going to make it very hard for them to quietly bury this the way they buried the first one." The review convened that evening in a chamber 2 tiers above the hollow, curved walls and a long stone table, and the particular chill of institutional lighting that made everyone under it look slightly more guilty than they actually were. And Overseer Dranth Vel arrived in person this time, which Karas had warned Rihin meant the matter had stopped being administrative and started being political. Vel was Kathier, older than Karas, scarred along one side of his jaw in the specific pattern that marked a rank earned through decades rather than granted through favor, and he opened the proceedings without preamble, the way a man opens something he has already decided the shape of and intends to see confirmed. "Cadet Voss, you disregarded a direct kill order from your proctor, physically interposed yourself in a live combat trial without authorization, assumed unsanctioned command of Academy property, and disregarded a second direct order from regional command to resume the trial." He let the silence after that sit long enough to be uncomfortable. "Do you dispute any of that account?" "No, Overseer," Rihin said. "No mitigating context. No claim of miscommunication." "I heard every order clearly," Rihin said. "I chose not to follow the ones that would have gotten a cadet killed to keep a broadcast schedule intact. I'll stand behind that choice in this room or any other." Something moved behind Vel's 4 black eyes that might, on a species with more expressive faces, have been grudging respect, though his voice gave nothing away. "That is precisely the kind of certainty this academy trains out of cadets for good reason, Voss. An officer who overrides orders on his own judgment is an officer who cannot be trusted to follow orders when his judgment is wrong." "With respect, Overseer," Karas said, and it was the first time he'd spoken since the proceedings opened, "I have spent 19 years being exactly the kind of officer you're describing, trusted to follow orders. It cost 6 cadets their names and their families the truth, and it nearly cost a 7th cadet his life today, because the officer trained not to question a kill order very nearly didn't question this one either. Cadet Voss's judgment was not merely correct. It was the only correct judgment in that arena, and every trained instinct in that room, mine included, was working against it." Vel's jaw tightened, the old scar along it pulling pale. You are aware, Proctor, that this confession implicates you directly in a 19-year concealment. I am aware, Karas said. I filed the full account this afternoon, before this review convened, addressed to the regional archive and to the 6 families whose names it names for the first time in 19 years. I did not wait to be asked, because I have already spent 19 years being the kind of officer who waits to be asked, and I have decided I am finished being him. The chamber was quiet for a long moment. Rihin watched Overseer Vel weigh a public record now circulating on 400,000 screens, a proctor's voluntary confession that had already been filed and could not be quietly walked back, and a 9-minute clip that showed, with a clarity no closed review could spin, exactly which version of Threndel Academy the wider public had just watched with their own eyes. Cadet Voss will receive a formal citation for insubordination, Vel said at last, each word measured out like currency he resented spending. It will remain on his record permanently, as procedure requires. He paused. He will also receive the Academy's merit of standing, for actions resulting in the preservation of a cadet's life under direct hazard, which will likewise remain on his record permanently, as procedure requires. The two will sit beside each other, and any future review board that wishes to understand what kind of cadet Rihin Voss is may read them in the order they were earned. It was not forgiveness. It was not even strictly approval. But it was, Rihin understood, about as close to an institution admitting it had been wrong as an institution like this one was built to give, and he'd take it, ribs and all. Trial 9 is permanently retired, Vel continued, pending full reconstruction of the arena floor and formal reassignment of Warden 6 to Handler Corps' rescue training program, which, I am informed by the handler, the Academy discontinued 40 years ago in favor of combat trials, and which we will now be reinstating, because it turns out the wardens never actually stopped being good at the job we bred them for. We simply stopped asking them to do it. Handler Corps, seated at the far end of the table, said nothing at all, but the set of her feathered crest, laid flat and still along her skull, read to Rihin, 11 months into learning to read species that didn't share a single human muscle, like something very close to satisfaction. The memorial was held 11 days later, in the hollow itself, because Karas had insisted on it despite 2 separate suggestions from regional administration, that a smaller, less visible venue might be more appropriate for what amounted to an official apology. The arena floor had been cleared of training gear entirely for the occasion, the old northeast quadrant patched now, but deliberately left with a visible seam in the new stone rather than sanded smooth. Karas's decision. A scar left where a scar belonged, ringed with 6 low markers cut from the same pale granite as the rest of the floor, each one carrying a name the Academy had kept sealed in a classified casualty file for 19 years. The families came. Not all of them. 19 years was long enough that some had scattered across systems Threndel Academy's own courier network could no longer easily reach, but enough that the tiers, cleared of cadets for the first hour, held a scattering of Kathir in the muted gray-green morning, wraps their culture used, standing in small clusters that had clearly spent the last 11 days rehearsing questions they were finally, after 19 years, going to get honest answers to. Rihin stood near the back, out of uniform in the loose civilian gray the Academy issued for off-duty hours, his arm still in its brace, and had not intended to be anywhere near the front of anything. This wasn't his grief to stand inside of. He'd pulled one boy out of a hole. The 6 markers in front of him belonged to people he'd never known, killed before he was old enough to walk, and the only claim he had to standing here at all was that finding them had been an accident of listening to the wrong wall at the right moment. Karas spoke first, and did not soften a single fact. He named the training protocol that had put 3rd years in a collapsing structure with the lights cut. He named the review that had closed itself in 6 days without ever interviewing a single surviving witness, beyond the one who'd gone back in for the bodies. He named himself plainly as the cadet who had chosen silence over expulsion, and did not ask the assembled families for forgiveness, because, he said, in a voice gone rough in a way Rehin had never once heard from him across 11 months of drills, that was not a thing 19 years of silence had earned him the right to request. He offered them, instead, the full account, filed permanently and publicly this time, and the reformed warden program that would, going forward, mean no cadet at Threndel Academy would ever again face a live trial with nobody trained to listen for exactly this kind of failure. One of the mourners, an elder Kathir woman with a crest gone entirely silver, mother or grandmother to one of the 6 names on the markers, Rehin never learned which, crossed the floor afterward, past the small clustered groups of family and staff, directly to where he stood at the back of the tiers with his brace and his borrowed civilian gray. "You are the human," she said. It wasn't a question, and her translated voice carried none of the accusation he'd half braced for. The one who put his hand on the floor. "Yes, ma'am. My son was one of the 6. I have spent 19 years being told the ground here was safe, and that his death was simply an accident nobody could have prevented." She studied him with 4 black eyes that had clearly done a great deal of studying in 19 years, weighing questions and answers and the particular gap between them. "You found the crack in 4 minutes. What took this academy 19 years to find the courage to admit?" Rehin didn't have an answer that would have made her wait shorter, or her son's death less buried under 6 months of hasty new concrete, and he didn't try to invent one. "I don't know, ma'am. I think sometimes it takes one more person refusing to look away before everyone else remembers they were allowed to look at all." She held his gaze a moment longer and then reached out, a gesture Rehin hadn't seen a Kathir make toward anyone outside their own species in 11 months at the academy, and rested one clawed hand, light and brief, against his uninjured shoulder. "Then I am glad it was you standing on that floor," she said, and moved on to speak with Karas, leaving Rehin standing very still at the back of the tiers with an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with 4 cracked ribs. Sol found him afterward, near the exit arch, his splint down to a lighter brace now, the swelling around his eye long since faded, walking with a steadiness that hadn't been in his gait 3 years of mess hall seating charts ago. "Dreeth's requested formal transfer into Handler Corps' new program," Sol said, without preamble, in the flat, careful way he delivered most things that mattered to him. "Said he wants to actually be useful to a warden instead of just standing near one being useless. I told him I'd think about whether I wanted him in it with me." "What do you decide?" "I decided I'm allowed to make him earn it slow," Sol said, and there was something almost like humor under the flatness now, a dry thread Rehin recognized, with a small, private jolt as an echo of his own. "I'm not in a hurry to make it easy for him, but I'm not going to spend the rest of my time here pretending the ground under both of us didn't just get more solid than it was a month ago." "That's about as fair a call as I've heard anybody make all week," Rehin said. Sol looked up at him, still smaller than most of his cohort, still pale along the seams where his carapace was taking its time hardening, but standing with a different weight in his shoulders than the boy who'd learned to fold himself invisible in a mess hall full of cadets twice his size. "I asked Handler Corps if I could train as a junior handler instead of finishing out as a combat cadet. She said the academy's never run a program like that before, not properly, not since before the first collapse." "What do you tell her?" "I told her somebody's got to be the first," Sol said, and for the first time since Rehin had pulled him out of 19 years of dark, he smiled with both sides of his face at once. Sol's parents arrived 2 days after the memorial, having spent the intervening weeks in transit from a border settlement 3 jumps out, and requested, through the academy's formal liaison office, in the careful, deliberate language of people unused to asking institutions for anything and half expecting to be refused, a brief audience with the cadet who had brought their son up out of the dark. Rehin met them in the same annex courtyard where he'd sat with Priya over bitter tea, and found them nothing at all like he'd half expected from a boy who spent 3 years making himself small in a mess hall full of larger cadets. Sol's father was broad and quiet, a dock engineer by trade, his carapace scarred along one flank in a pattern that spoke of some old accident of his own. His mother was smaller, sharper-eyed, with the restless energy of someone who had clearly spent every one of the last several weeks imagining every possible version of this conversation, and had still not settled on which one she wanted to have. "He told us what you said to him," she said, without preamble, once the formal academy pleasantries had been exchanged and set aside. "Down in that vault. That he'd held it together for 40 minutes and that was nerve, not luck." Her voice caught, steadied. "We spent 3 years being told by this same academy, gently in the careful language institutions use, that our son might not harden into a proper cadet on schedule, that perhaps a different placement, a gentler track, might suit him better. We let ourselves start to believe them, because it is a hard thing to keep believing in a child louder than the people trained to evaluate him." "He proved every one of those evaluations wrong," Rehin said, "not because I told him to. Because he already had it in him, and nobody'd bothered to look in the right place for it before that day." Sol's father studied him a long moment, the quiet, weighing look of an engineer accustomed to reading load and strain in things that couldn't speak for themselves. "You are not what I expected when the report said a human cadet had defied a kill order to reach our son. I expected," he paused, searching for the word through the collar's translation lag, "a soldier, someone built for the moment, trained for glory in it." "I'm an engineer who got tired of being too slow," Rehin said. "That's most of what I am, under the parts that made the broadcast feed." "Then I am glad this academy had an engineer standing in the right place, and not a soldier," Sol's mother said, and crossed the small distance between them, and made the same brief, clawed hand gesture the elder mourner had made at the memorial, a Cathar courtesy Rehin understood by now was not offered lightly. "Whatever debt a family can owe a stranger, we owe you, Cadet Voss. We do not know your customs well enough to know how such a thing is properly repaid." "You don't owe me anything," Rehin said. "Just keep letting him choose his own track from here. That's payment enough for anybody who ever pulled somebody out of a hole for a living." They stayed 2 more days, long enough to watch Sol run a training circuit in Corps' annex with a steadiness that made his mother's sharp eyes go bright and wet at the corners in a way she made no effort to hide, and long enough for his father to walk the length of the sealed undering markers with Karas, engineer to engineer, asking the kind of precise structural questions that Rehin suspected were the only language the man had left for grief that size. When their transport finally lifted off the receiving yard, Sol stood watching it go with the particular stillness of a cadet who had spent 3 years believing himself unremarkable and was only now slowly starting to unlearn it. And Rehin let him have the silence for as long as he needed it before clapping a hand once lightly on his good shoulder and steering him back toward the annex, because grief and pride made a strange, heavy pairing. And the only cure either of them had ever found for either was getting back to work. 6 weeks later, the brace came off Rehin's shoulder on the same morning. A supply tunnel 3 kilometers south of the academy's outer wall folded in on itself during a minor seismic tremor nobody had bothered to flag as dangerous, because minor tremors along that fault line happened 4 or 5 times a cycle, and none of them had ever done more than rattle the mess hall crockery before. This one caved a 200-meter stretch of transit bore that a dozen Cathar dock laborers had been running supply crawlers through at the time, and by the time the alert reached Threndel Academy, the old response would have meant a slow mobilization of general-purpose rescue crews from the nearest city, a 4-hour transit delay, and Rehin understood without anyone needing to say it out loud. A set of odds for anyone still breathing in that bore that got worse by the minute. The new response took 11 minutes to reach the collapse site, because the new response was Handler Corps' reinstated program, riding in a transport crate rigged for exactly this kind of call. With Warden 6 coiled and alert in the back, Sol Tar crouched beside the beast's flank, running a gloved hand along its foreleg in the low, steady contact Core had spent 6 weeks teaching him, and Dreeth Call hauling gear with the grim, focused silence of a cadet who had decided, somewhere in the last month and a half, that being useful was the only apology that actually counted. Karras authorized the deployment before the transport had finished its first kilometer. He didn't call a review board. He didn't wait for a regional overseer's approval. He simply gave the order, the same flat cadence he'd always used, except now it carried a different weight underneath it. The weight of a proctor who had learned, at considerable cost, exactly what waiting cost the people on the other end of a collapse. Rihin rode out with them without being asked twice, shoulder freshly unbraced, and aching in the particular way of a joint that hadn't fully trusted its own strength yet. Because 11 months at this academy and one very long day in the dark had taught him that some skills didn't belong to a uniform or a rank. They belonged to whoever had learned them, and he'd learned this one the hard way, on a planet 300 light-years from here. Pulling strangers out of rubble that didn't care what species they were. The bore was worse than the alert had suggested. A support arch had failed along its full length rather than at a single point, folding the tunnel roof down in a long, uneven trough that had trapped the supply crawler and its crew somewhere in the middle third, cut off from both exits, with dust so thick in the air that the first response team's lights barely carried 3 meters into it. 6 laborers unaccounted for, the site foreman reported, a broad-built Cathier dock supervisor with dust already caked into every seam of his carapace from a failed attempt to dig in by hand before backup arrived. 2 more we can see near the near-collapse point, conscious, can't reach them without shoring first. The other 4 are further in. We can't raise them on comm. Core was already down at the collapse point, palm flat against the tunnel wall the same way Rihin had once pressed his own hand to arena granite, and Warden 6 stood beside her with its blind, wedge-shaped head lowered, forelimbs testing the ground with the same careful, listening patience it had shown 6 weeks earlier in a much smaller, much more visible hole. He's reading 4 separate pulses, Core said, all 4 further in, past the worst of the fold. Sol palm on the wall here, tell me what you feel under mine. Sol knelt beside her without hesitation, without the flinch Rihin half expected from a cadet whose last experience with a collapsing structure had nearly killed him, and pressed his smaller hand flat against the stone beside the handlers. He was quiet for a long moment, dust settling in his lashes, his splint-scarred arm steady. Vibrations uneven, he said, stronger toward the left wall, like something still shifting slow, not stopped. He glanced up, checking his own read against Core's face the way a cadet checks an instructor's, and found her giving him nothing but an even, waiting silence that meant she wanted his answer, not her own. I think the left side's still settling. If we brace there first, the right side should hold on its own weight a while longer. That's exactly right, Core said, and the plain, unhurried approval in her voice did more for the boy's spine, Rihin thought, than 100 formal citations ever could have. Dreeth hauled bracing struts in from the transport at a pace that had him breathing hard inside of 2 minutes. No complaint in it, no performance either, just the flat, grinding effort of a cadet working off a debt he understood correctly, would take longer than one good afternoon to clear. Rihin worked beside him, favoring the shoulder without babying it, running lines and checking load points with the same unhurried economy he'd used in the underring, and found, somewhere in the second hour, that nobody on this crew was waiting for him to prove anything. They already knew what he could do. They'd watched the recording 400,000 times before most of them had even met him. It took 3 hours to reach the 4 laborers trapped deepest in the fold, working the tunnel open a controlled meter at a time, Warden 6's claws doing the patient, listening excavation it had been bred 4 centuries ago to do, and had spent 40 years forgetting it was allowed to. All 6 laborers came out alive. One had a crushed hand that would need regrowth therapy and would never fully match its twin again, and 2 had cracked plates along their lower carapace that would keep them off duty for a season. But none of them came out the way the 6 cadets in the undering had gone in 19 years ago. And that difference, Rehin understood, standing at the mouth of the bore in the gray evening light with dust in every fold of his clothes and his shoulder finally, honestly done for the day, was the actual size of what had changed. Not a single trial won, not a single beast defeated, just 6 more names that would get to keep being spoken by the people who loved them, because somewhere along the way an academy had finally remembered what its wardens were for. Karas met them at the transport bay when they got back, and said nothing at all for a long moment, just stood there in the last of the daylight looking at the 6 laborers being loaded onto medical transports under their own power, and at Sol standing steady beside Handler Core with dust on his small hands and something new and solid in the set of his shoulders, and at Dreeth hauling the last of the gear without being told twice, and at Rehin favoring a shoulder that had finally earned its rest. 6 weeks ago, Karas said finally, this academy would have called this an acceptable loss and closed the review in 6 days. And today, Rehin asked. Today it called it a Tuesday, Karas said, and every single one of them is going home. It wasn't praise, not exactly, not in any register Threndel Academy usually dealt in. But Rehin had spent 11 months learning to read what Kathir voices did instead of praise, and he heard, underneath the flat proctor's cadence, something that sounded a great deal like the sound Warden 6 had made in the hollow the moment it broke through to a boy it had been listening for the whole time, not mournful at all, once you knew how to hear it. Relief. The season turned slow after that, the way seasons at Threndel Academy always did, training cycles bleeding into examination weeks bleeding into the long gray stretch before graduation intake, and Rehin found himself, somewhere in the middle of it, spending more hours in Handler Core's rebuilt rescue training annex than he did on the main combat floor. Nobody had ordered him there. Karas had simply stopped scheduling him for standard drills on the days Corps requested him, which was, in its own quiet Kathir way, closer to an official assignment than any written order would have been. You keep flinching before you press your palm down, Corps told him one gray afternoon, watching him run a training circuit with a fresh cohort of 3rd years learning to read stress vibration through simulated rubble. Small thing, most people wouldn't catch it. Old habit, Rehin said, and didn't elaborate, and she didn't push, which was one of the things he'd come to respect about her most. She asked exactly as much as the moment required, and no more. The same instinct that had made her Warden 6's handler for 30 years instead of merely its keeper. The tunnels, she said anyway, quiet, not a question, before this academy. 3 of them, Rehin said, back home. 4th one was a mine shaft, which is technically not a tunnel, but it collapsed the same way, so I've stopped bothering to correct people about the distinction. He kept his hand steady against the simulated rubble face, feeling for the practice signal buried somewhere in the stack, and found it on the 2nd pass, cleaner than the first time he'd tried the drill 6 weeks ago. I got good at listening for people because I got tired of the alternative. That's most of the whole story. Cor considered that for a while, crest lying flat and thoughtful along her skull. Most cadets who come through my program come because a beast pulled at something in them they didn't understand yet. You came already fluent in the actual language it speaks. I've had 30 years of handlers. I've never had one who didn't need me to teach him the first half of the job. I had a good teacher before I ever got here, Rehin said. Different uniform. Same lesson. The ground doesn't lie to you if you're willing to actually listen to it, instead of telling it what you expect to hear. Sol had taken to the rescue program with a focus that surprised nobody who'd watched him hold together for 40 minutes alone in the dark, and less surprising still, had taken to teaching the newest intake of 1st years with a patience that had nothing performative in it. The patience, Rehin thought, watching him crouch beside a nervous first-year hatchling half his own size and walk her through the same vibration-reading drill core had once walked him through. Of someone who remembered exactly what it felt like to be the smallest one in the room, and had decided, deliberately, that nobody under his teaching would ever feel that alone again. "You're better at this than I was at your age," Rihin told him, watching from the annex doorway. "I had better material to learn from," Sol said, without looking up from the hatchling's grip on the practice line, and there was enough dry precision in it now, enough of an echo of Rihin's own register, that Priya, leaning against the doorframe beside Rihin with a datapad full of the curriculum notes Karas had asked her to help draft, laughed out loud for the first time in what felt like weeks. "He's picking up your worst habits," she said. "He's picking up the only good ones I've got," Rihin said. "Everything else about me is a work in progress." Dreeth's road back was slower and rougher, and Rihin didn't push it along any faster than it wanted to go, because some debts weren't his to forgive on Sol's behalf, and some progress only counted if nobody rushed it. But Dreeth showed up to the annex every cycle without fail, hauled every crate he was handed without complaint, and had started in the last few weeks, doing something that struck Rihin as the truest measure of the change in him. Correcting other cadets, gently, the older ones especially, when he heard them slide back into calling Sol Halfshell in the mess hall, not with a lecture, just a flat, quiet, "His name's Tar," that had, more than once now, ended the joke before it finished landing. The clearest proof of it came a month into the annex work, when a visiting second year from a different cohort, one who hadn't been on the floor for the trial and knew Dreeth's old reputation better than his new one, made a crack in the training yard about half-shell cadets being handed easy postings to keep them out of real fights. Rihin wasn't there for it. He heard about it afterward from Priya, who'd watched the whole thing unfold from the annex doorway with her arms crossed, and by her own account, not the slightest urge to intervene. Dreeth hadn't shouted. He hadn't shoved anyone, hadn't done any of the things the old Dreeth would have reached for first. He'd simply stepped between the visiting cadet and Sol, close enough that the size difference did the talking his voice didn't need to, and said, in a flat, level tone Priya swore sounded uncomfortably like Rihin's own, that Sol Tar had held together alone in the dark for 40 minutes with a fractured arm and no idea anyone was coming, and that the visiting cadet was welcome to try matching that particular achievement before he opened his mouth about who counted as a real fighter. The second year hadn't had a comeback for it. Nobody in the yard, apparently, had needed him to. "You should have seen his face," Priya told Rihin later, still faintly delighted. "Dreeth's, I mean, like he surprised himself as much as anybody else." "That's usually how it starts," Rihin said. "Man does one decent thing without planning to, finds out he's got more of them in him than he thought." The curriculum notes Karas had asked Rihin and Priya to help draft became, over the course of that season, a document considerably longer than either of them had expected it to be. A full redesign of every live combat trial run at Threndel Academy, built around a single hard requirement neither Rihin nor Karas would compromise on in the review meetings. No cadet would ever again face a trial without a rescue-trained handler stationed on the floor, and no proctor would ever again be permitted to overrule that handler's read of a structure once the trial had begun. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't come with a broadcast feed or a review board citation. But Rihin understood, filling in the last clause of the document late one evening with Priya reading over his shoulder and Karas's approval already logged at the top, that it was probably the most permanent thing he'd ever built in his life, more permanent than any wall he'd shored up back home, because a wall could fail again someday, and a rule, once it was truly written into how an institution trained its young, tended to outlast the people who'd fought to put it there. "You know they're calling it the VAS protocol on 2 of the Allied Academy networks," Priya said, scrolling through a feed she probably shouldn't have been checking during curriculum review hours. "They shouldn't," Rihin said. "Ought to be the TAR protocol, or the Karas protocol, or just the protocol, no names attached, because names attached to a rule are the first thing a future overseer strips off it when he wants to quietly walk it back. That's a very tidy, very human way of trying to avoid a compliment, Priya said. I've had practice, Rehin said, and went back to the document and didn't argue the point any further because she wasn't wrong, and there wasn't much use pretending otherwise to someone who'd hauled a recovery line beside him in the dark. The new Trial 9 ran for the first time on the first morning of graduation season, on a rebuilt arena floor that carried, if you knew where to look, a single visible seam of paler granite across its northeast quadrant, and Rehin stood on the rimwalk instead of the floor this time, because the redesigned protocol didn't call for a cadet with 11 months seniority to be down in the crescent anymore. It called for a rescue-trained handler stationed at the exact spot where the old trial had once demanded blind aggression, and this time that handler was Handler Corps, with Sol Tar, third-year cadet, junior handler in training, still smaller than most of his cohort and entirely unbothered by it now, standing at her shoulder with a data slate tracking vibration readouts across the whole floor in real time. The beast released into the ring that morning wasn't Warden 6. The Academy had 2 more deep wardens in its keeping, both pulled off active combat rotation and reassigned to Corps' expanding program over the last season, and the one they'd chosen for the graduation demonstration. A younger, leaner animal the cadets had already nicknamed the Latch, for the way it locked onto a scent trail and refused to let go came through the gate at a pace that read, to anyone who'd learned to watch a warden's gait instead of just its size, as searching rather than hunting from the very first step. Karas gave the trial's opening order from the rimwalk beside Rehin, and it bore almost no resemblance to the one that had opened Trial 9 8 months earlier. Cadets converge on defensive formation only. This trial tests your ability to read the animal's behavior and respond to Handler Corps' guidance in real time. No cadet strikes the warden without direct handler authorization. If any cadet believes the floor is compromised, they call it, immediately, no rank deference, no hesitation, and the trial stops the instant they do. 23 new cadets, first years mostly, none of them old enough to have been at the academy the day a section of granite had cracked open under a beast everyone had misread, fanned out across the floor in a loose, watchful crescent, and Rehin watched them hold their formation with a discipline that had nothing to do with fear of a kill order and everything to do with genuinely paying attention to what was in front of them. 11 minutes in, a young Kathir cadet near the western edge of the crescent, smaller than her cohort mates, moving with the particular caution of someone new enough to the academy that every instinct still felt borrowed, called a halt. "Floor's uneven under my left foot," she said, not shouting, not panicking, just reporting it flat and clear the way the new protocol had drilled into every cadet from their first week. "Might be nothing. Wanted it logged before I moved off it." The trial stopped instantly. Cor crossed the floor herself inside of 30 seconds, knelt, pressed her palm flat to the spot the cadet had flagged, and pronounced it, after a careful minute, an old drainage channel from the arena's original construction. Nothing structural, nothing dangerous, but exactly the kind of anomaly the old protocol would have trained every cadet in that ring to run straight past without a second thought, chasing a kill order that valued speed over attention. "Good call," Cor told her, loud enough for the whole formation to hear. "That's the entire job, not being fearless. Being willing to say something's wrong before you know for certain, and trusting the floor will still be there to hear you say it." The young cadet's throat plates flared, something that on a Kathir first year read as equal parts pride and relief, and the trial resumed and finished, 17 minutes later, with every single cadet still standing. The Latch curled calm at the center of the ring with Sol's small hand resting steady against its flank, and not one drop of blood anywhere on the new granite floor. "That's the whole difference, isn't it?" Priya said, arriving at Rehin's elbow on the rimwalk, watching the cadets file out in loose, easy conversation instead of the grim, adrenaline-strung silence that used to follow every old Trial 9. Nobody down there today had to be a hero. That was always the point, Rihin said. A system that only works because one person's willing to break it under pressure isn't a system. It's a lucky accident waiting to happen again to somebody who doesn't get lucky. He watched the last of the cadets clear the arches, the young cadet who'd called the halt walking out beside two cohort mates who were, from the look of it, telling her she'd done well rather than teasing her for slowing the trial down. Best thing any of us built this season wasn't getting soul out of that hole. It was making sure the next soul never falls into one in the first place. The pushback came 3 weeks later, and Rihin had known, in the part of his mind that never fully trusted an institution's better instincts to hold once the initial shock wore off, that it would. It arrived in the form of a regional council session, called at Overseer Vell's request, to review what the summons called comparative graduate readiness across Allied Academy training doctrines. Bureaucratic language that meant, once Karas had finished translating the actual stakes for Rihin and Priya over a hurried breakfast, that two rival academies in the coalition had spent the season quietly lobbying to have Threndel's reformed protocol declared a liability. On the grounds that a generation of cadets trained without live lethal stakes would graduate soft, unprepared for actual combat postings, a danger to themselves and their future units. They're not wrong that combat readiness matters, Karas said, pacing the narrow width of his office with a restlessness Rihin hadn't seen in him since the memorial. They are wrong about what produces it, but wrong arguments backed by academies with 3 centuries of prestige, and a council that remembers the old numbers fondly have beaten right arguments before Voss. I need more than a good feeling walking into that chamber. Then let's bring numbers, Rihin said. They brought numbers. Priya spent 4 days compiling them, cross-referencing every metric the Academy tracked against the 8 months since the reformed trials had taken effect. Injury rates down by a margin that made the old figures look, in Karas's flat assessment, like a training program that had been actively trying to produce casualties rather than cadets. Graduate performance scores on independent post-academy assessments, unchanged where the coalition's fear-mongering predicted collapse, and measurably higher on every metric involving judgment under unexpected pressure, which Core pointed out, dryly, in the same meeting, was rather the entire point of training cadets to read a situation instead of simply reacting to an order. And they brought the tunnel collapse. Not as an anecdote, as a formal incident report. 6 laborers extracted alive by a rescue team built entirely from the reformed program's first cohort, cross-referenced against the regional casualty statistics for comparable tremor-related collapses handled by conventional response crews over the previous decade. A data set that made the argument in a way no speech Rihin could have written ever would. The council chamber, when they finally stood in it, was larger and colder than the review room from 8 months earlier, tiered benches rising on all sides holding delegates from 4 allied academies, and Overseer Vell opened the session with the same measured, currency-spending cadence he'd used the first time, laying out the case for a return to what he called doctrinal rigor with the smooth, patient confidence of a man who had done this exact kind of argument 100 times before and expected to win it again. A delegate from one of the 2 rival academies, a broad-jawed Kathir with the deep, unbroken slate coloring of someone who had never once had his authority seriously questioned, pressed the doctrinal rigor case hardest, leaning forward over the tiered bench with the confident aggression of a man used to arguments folding under weight rather than reason. Combat postings do not wait for a cadet to finish listening, he said. An enemy does not pause 4 seconds so a nervous graduate can decide whether the ground feels wrong. Your reformed doctrine produces cadets comfortable with hesitation. We do not consider that an improvement. We consider it a liability wearing a kinder name. With respect, Karas said, before Rihin could open his mouth, I have commanded cadets under both doctrines. The old one produced cadets who charged confidently into 6 deaths in a single collapsed vault, and a proctor too well trained in obedience to ask why the vault had no business being used for a live trial in the first place. I would rather graduate a cohort slow enough to notice the 6 deaths waiting to happen than one fast enough to walk straight into them without blinking. The rival delegate's jaw tightened, but he didn't yield the point outright. One incident, however tragic, is not doctrine. It is not one incident, Cor said, her voice cutting cool and level across the chamber. It is 31 incidents this cycle alone, each one a name that would otherwise be etched on a wall instead of walking home to a family. I have 30 years commanding wardens under both doctrines, honored delegate. I will match my record against yours in front of any council in this coalition, on any world, at any time you care to name. Nobody in the chamber answered that particular challenge, and the rival delegate settled back into his bench with the stiff, unhappy silence of a man who had walked in certain of an easy argument and was only now beginning to suspect otherwise. And when the council's questions turned, as Rehin had known they eventually would, to the human cadet whose name kept appearing at the center of every account, Karas didn't answer for him. Cadet Voss can speak for himself, the proctor said, and stepped back, and Rehin understood it for what it was, not a proctor passing the floor to a junior cadet out of procedure, but a man who had spent 19 years letting an institution speak for him instead of speaking the truth himself, making very sure he never did that to anyone else again. Rehin kept it short, because he'd learned a long time ago that the people most invested in an argument were usually the ones most tempted to over-explain it, and over-explaining rarely won anyone over who wasn't already convinced. Back where I trained before this academy, we used to run drills the way your rivals want you to keep running yours, he said, to the tiered benches, to Vel, to 4 allied delegations who had never once set foot on Earth, and were about to hear a version of it distilled down to the one lesson that mattered here. Hard, fast, unforgiving, because somebody decided fear built better soldiers than judgment did. We buried a lot of good people finding out that was wrong. The soldiers who actually survived the situations nobody trained them for weren't the ones who'd been taught to charge through every warning sign without stopping. They were the ones who'd been taught to notice the warning sign in the first place and trust themselves enough to say something before it got somebody killed. He looked at Vel directly, not unkindly, not with any heat in it at all. You can train fear into a cadet in about a week. It's cheap and it's fast and it looks impressive on a broadcast feed. Judgment takes longer and it doesn't look like much until the day it matters, and on that day it's the only thing that's ever actually saved anyone. I'd rather graduate a cohort that's slow to look impressive and fast to keep each other alive. The council didn't rule that day. Councils never ruled the day they heard an argument. Karas had warned him. That wasn't how the process worked. But the vote came down 11 days later, and it came down 4-1 in favor of Threndel Academy's reformed protocol, with a formal recommendation that the 3 other allied academies review their own doctrines against it inside the coming cycle. Overseer Vel did not attend the announcement. Karas told Rehin, with the particular dry satisfaction of a man who had waited 19 years to feel it, that Vel had requested a transfer to an administrative posting considerably further from any academy with a live broadcast feed. Rehin didn't feel triumphant about any of it, not really. Mostly he felt tired, the specific bone-deep tired of a long fight finally over, and grateful in a way that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with the simple, plain fact that 400 future cadets a cycle, across 4 academies, were now going to train under a system built to keep them breathing, instead of one built to see how much fear they could survive before they broke. That, he thought, walking out of the council chamber into a gray afternoon with Priya at his shoulder, and Sol waiting for them both at the transport dock, with a data slate full of the next cohort's training schedule already loaded, was the only kind of winning that had ever actually mattered to him. He hadn't told most of them why he'd left Earth in the first place, and nobody at Threndel Academy had ever pushed hard enough to make him. It wasn't a secret, exactly. It just wasn't a story that came up easily in a mess hall full of cadets more interested in trial scores than in a transfer's reasons, and Rehin had never been the kind of man who volunteered his history unless somebody had earned the asking. Priya earned it, eventually, on a quiet evening a few days after the council's ruling, sitting on the low wall outside the rescue annex with 2 mugs of the bitter Academy issue, tea neither of them particularly liked, and both of them drank anyway out of habit, watching the last of the daylight burn cool blue-gray off the polished stone of the courtyard. "You ever going to tell me the actual reason you signed up for an exchange posting to an alien combat academy?" she asked. "Because I wanted to see the galaxy has never once sounded like the whole answer coming from you." Rehin turned the mug in his hands, watching steam curl off it into the cooling air. Coalition opened the exchange program 4 years after Earth signed on, mostly to build goodwill, mostly filled by people who wanted the adventure of it. I signed up because I'd spent 4 years in the Corps pulling people out of collapsed ground back home, and I was good at it. And being good at it stopped being enough reason to keep doing it after the 5th time I didn't get there fast enough. He didn't look at her while he said it, kept his eyes on the darkening courtyard instead. Last one was a residential collapse. Quake, nothing anybody could have predicted. Structure came down on a building with 41 people inside. We got 38 out. I was team lead. I've got 3 names I still say to myself most nights, not because anybody blames me for it. The review cleared the whole unit, textbook response. Nothing we could have done faster, but because knowing that doesn't actually make 3 names lighter to carry. "That's not a reason to leave your own planet," Priya said, gently, no judgment in it. "No," Rehin agreed. "The reason I left was that I came back from that collapse and realized I'd started flinching before I even reached a scene, bracing for the names I'd failed to save before I'd even started looking for the ones I could. That's not useful to anybody, not to the people trapped, not to the team standing next to me depending on my judgment holding steady. I needed somewhere far enough away to remember what steady actually felt like before I trusted myself with anyone's life again." He finally looked at her, something wry and worn at the edges of it. "Turns out the somewhere I needed was an alien academy with a sealed tomb under its arena floor, and a beast nobody had bothered to actually listen to in 40 years. Funny how that works out." "Not funny," Priya said. "Fitting, maybe. Sounds like exactly the kind of problem you'd have to travel 300 light-years to find, since apparently the universe agrees you're better at fixing this specific kind of broken than almost anybody else it's got on offer." "I don't know about that." "I do," she said simply, and didn't elaborate and didn't need to, because they'd both stood at the edge of that crack in the arena floor 8 months ago, and knew exactly what each other was capable of when it mattered. And there wasn't much use pretending otherwise between 2 people who'd already run a recovery line together in the dark. Rehin hadn't written home in 3 months, which was longer than he usually let himself go. And that evening, back in the narrow quarters he'd been assigned since his first week at the academy, he finally sat down and did it. Not a long letter. He'd never been one for those. Just a short message routed through the coalition relay to a small apartment on the other side of the galaxy, where his mother still kept his old course citation pinned to the kitchen wall. Because she'd never quite believed, he'd stopped being proud of it, even after he'd stopped being able to look at it without flinching. He told her about the crack in the granite, and the boy he'd pulled out of 19 years of dark, and the tunnel collapse that had come after, and the 6 laborers who'd gone home to their families, because a program he'd helped rebuild had finally been trusted to work the way it was always supposed to. He didn't tell her about the 3 names he still said most nights. Some things a letter across 300 light-years wasn't built to carry, and some grief a son kept for himself, not because he didn't trust his mother with it, but because carrying it quietly was the last small kindness he had left to offer the people who hadn't made it out. He signed it the way he always had, since he was young enough that signing his own name had still felt like an achievement, and sent it into the relay before he could talk himself into softening any of it, and sat for a while afterward in the narrow quiet of his quarters, listening to the low hum of the academy settling into its own nightly rhythms around him, and found, for the first time in longer than he could easily count, that the quiet didn't feel like waiting for the next bad thing to happen. It just felt like quiet. Graduation assessments ran the last week of the cycle, and Rehin's came due on a bright, cold morning with the kind of clean, hard light that made the hollow's tiered granite look almost silver. Every cadet in his year cohort assembled on the rimwalk to watch, because academy tradition held that a cadet's final assessment belonged to the whole cohort as much as to the cadet standing it, a shared reckoning of 11 months spent training side by side. The assessment wasn't a fight. That, too, was new. Under the reformed protocol, a graduating cadet's final trial tested judgment under compound pressure rather than raw combat skill, a live scenario built by the proctor staff to be genuinely unpredictable, scored on decisions made rather than kills logged. Rehin had known the broad shape of it going in and nothing more, which was, Karas had told him with something that might almost have been a smile if Kathir faces had been built for smiling, entirely the point. They ran it in the rebuilt training annex rather than the open hollow, a simulated structure, 3 levels, seated with staged hazards and 2 volunteer role players standing in as trapped personnel, Warden 6 on hand, as the live Centen vibration element that made the whole exercise considerably less theoretical than a simulator alone could manage. Rehin went in alone, per the assessment's design, no team, no cable line partner, nothing but his own read of a structure and 11 months of everything the academy and the corps before it had taught him. He found the first role player in under 4 minutes, working a collapsed stairwell with the same unhurried, listening patience he'd used in a much darker hole 8 months earlier, and talked her through a controlled extraction without so much as raising his pulse. The second was harder, buried deeper, in a section rigged with a genuine structural hazard, a load-bearing beam positioned to test exactly the kind of judgment call that had nearly gotten him crushed the first time around, and he spent nearly 20 careful minutes on it, refusing every instinct that told him to move faster than the structure could safely bear, because he'd learned, in the hardest classroom there was, that speed without judgment was just a faster way to make things worse. When he finally brought the second role player clear, both of them dust-streaked and steady, Karas's voice came through the annex comm with the flat, familiar cadence Rehin had first heard 11 months earlier, ordering a cohort to attack a beast that had never once meant them harm. Assessment complete, time 31 minutes, 0 structural violations, 0 unnecessary risk exposure, both subjects extracted without additional injury. A pause longer than procedure strictly required. Cadet Voss. You are cleared for graduation, effective this cycle, with a formal recommendation for continued posting as instructional staff under Handler Corps' program, should you choose to accept it. The cohort on the rimwalk made the low, resonant hum again, the one that had rolled through the hollow the day Karas first suspended Trial 9, and this time Rehin let himself actually hear it instead of filing it away to process later, standing in the settling dust of a simulated collapse with 2 role players safely beside him, and 11 months of a hard, strange, necessary education finally, formally, behind him. Sol found him first, once the cohort had filed down off the rimwalk, still smaller than most of his year but standing now the way a cadet stood who had never once doubted his own place in a room since the day a human dug him out of the dark. "You're staying," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Corps made me a decent offer," Rehin said, "and somebody's got to keep teaching you all the worst habits before you graduate and start passing them down yourselves." "Good," Sol said simply, and that was the whole of it. No more sentiment required between the two of them than that, and Rehin understood it was exactly enough. Karas came down off the rimwalk last, moving through the dispersing cohort with the unhurried authority Rehin had grown used to over 11 months, and stopped in front of him without any of the formal proctor's cadence he usually reserved for graduation assessments. 11 months ago I told you that you had not once led an engagement, and that today you would. He studied Rehin a long moment, throat plates settled and still. I did not anticipate the engagement in question would take the shape it did. I am glad in the end that it did. I'm glad you led it, Rehin said. You could have pulled me off that line the second I broke the kill order. Most proctors would have. Most proctors have not spent 19 years learning exactly what it costs to follow the wrong order competently, Karas said. I recognized what you were doing before I admitted it to myself. That is not credit I am owed. It is simply the truth of that morning, and I find I would rather state it plainly than let anyone mistake my hesitation for foresight I did not actually have. Dreeth offered a hand to shake. An academy custom he'd clearly borrowed from watching the human cadets rather than any tradition of his own species, and did it with the slightly stiff formality of someone still not entirely sure he'd earned the right to make the gesture. Rehin shook it anyway, because 8 months of hauling gear without complaint had bought Dreeth Call a great deal more grace than one handshake could possibly cost. Priya didn't say anything at all. She just leaned against the annex doorway with her arms crossed and a look on her face that told Rehin, more clearly than any speech could have, that she'd known exactly how this would go from the moment she'd watched him kneel at a crack in the arena floor and press his palm flat against stone that everyone else in that trial had been too busy fighting to actually listen to. The undering was fully cleared by the end of that season, every meter of the old collapsed vault excavated, catalogued, and structurally sealed for good this time. Not hidden, not poured over, but closed with a formal marker set into the new floor above it. A simple plate of pale metal bearing 6 names, and beneath them, a single line Karas had insisted on wording himself, and had spent 3 drafts getting right. They were not forgotten because the ground finally learned to speak. The 6 families received the last of their dead with full honors in a ceremony considerably smaller and quieter than the first memorial, held not in the hollow this time, but in the Academy's old chapel hall, a room Rehin hadn't known existed until Karas led him to it the evening before, walking the proctor through the arrangements with a careful, deliberate attention that told Rehin this particular debt mattered to him more than almost anything else the reforms had accomplished. You didn't have to bring me to see this, Rehin said, standing beside him in the empty hall the evening before the service, 6 small alcoves prepared along the far wall, each one waiting for a name. No, Karas agreed, I wanted to. There is a difference, Voss, between an obligation and a choice, and I have spent 19 years mistaking the first for an excuse not to make the second. I would like, for whatever remains of my career here, to stop making that mistake. He was quiet for a moment, 4 black eyes fixed on the 6 waiting alcoves. I have requested that Trial 9's designation be formally retired. The council approved it this morning. The reformed protocol will run under a new name, chosen by the current cadet cohort, effective the next intake. What they pick? They call it the listening trial, Karas said, and something in his voice, flat as it still was, carried a weight that Rehin understood without needing 11 months of translation practice to read it. Sol proposed it. The vote was not close. Rehin didn't say anything for a while, standing in the quiet chapel hall with 6 empty alcoves waiting to be filled, and a proctor beside him who had spent 19 years carrying a silence that had finally, properly been set down. Good name, he said eventually. I thought so. Karas reached into a fold of his uniform and produced something small, metal, worn smooth along one edge, a fragment of the old support beam from the undering, Rehin realized, cut and polished into a flat disc no larger than a coin, a single line of Kathir script etched across its face. I had 6 of these made. 1 for each family, cut from the beam that held the ceiling long enough for me to reach them, 19 years too late to matter to anyone, but the debt I owed their memory. He held it out. I had a seventh made, for the cadet who reached the seventh person in time. Rehin took it, turning it over once in his palm, feeling the small, cool weight of it settle against his skin. I didn't do this for a coin, Karas. I know, Karas said. That is precisely why you're the one holding it. The next intake arrived at Threndel Academy on a bright morning almost a full cycle later, ferried in on transport shuttles that set down in the same wide receiving yard Rehin remembered crossing himself. 11 months a cadet and a lifetime ago, clutching a duffel bag and a set of orders that had told him almost nothing about what he was actually walking into. He stood on the receiving platform now in the plain gray and slate uniform of instructional staff, handler corps beside him, Sol a half-step back with a junior handler's insignia freshly stitched onto his collar, and watched the new cohort disembark in the particular ragged, wide-eyed clump of cadets who had trained hard enough to be accepted, and had absolutely no idea yet what that acceptance was actually going to ask of them. There were 3 humans in the new intake, the largest number the exchange program had sent in a single cycle since the program's founding, and Rehin watched them cluster instinctively together the way he remembered doing himself, the specific, useless comfort of standing near someone who at least breathed the same air pressure you were used to, even if it did nothing to make the alien architecture around you feel any less enormous. 2 of them were older, a broad-shouldered young man who kept glancing up at the receiving yard's high glass canopy like he expected it to fall, and a steadier woman a few years past him who'd clearly done some reading before she shipped out, judging by the way she was already sounding out the Kathir greeting posture on the dock crew unloading their transport. Word had reached them, Rehin gathered from the fragments of nervous conversation drifting his way, that a human cadet had once broken a kill order here and pulled a boy out from under the whole arena floor, and that the story had become, somewhere in the retelling between Earth recruitment offices and this receiving yard, a great deal more dramatic than the 11 exhausting, unglamorous minutes he actually remembered living through. He didn't correct it. Some stories did more good traveling a little taller than the truth, so long as the lesson underneath them stayed honest. One of them was small for her age, a thin, watchful girl who couldn't have been more than 17, standing slightly apart even from the other 2 humans, the particular posture of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, that standing apart was safer than being noticed. She caught Rehin looking and straightened, chin up, the reflexive bravado of someone determined not to look as lost as she felt. "Cadet Voss?" she asked, checking a name off a data slate, clearly having been briefed on who to look for among the instructional staff. "That's me. Not Voss to you, though, not for a few months yet." "Instructor's fine." He studied her a moment, the wary set of her shoulders, the way her eyes kept cutting to the massive tiered bowl of the hollow visible past the receiving yard's outer wall, close enough to make out the pale seam of new granite across its northeast quadrant even from this distance. "First time off Earth." "First time off the ground, actually," she admitted, some of the bravado cracking. "I washed out of 2 flight programs before this one took me. Figured an academy that trains for combat trials probably doesn't care much whether I can fly straight." "It cares whether you can listen straight," Rehin said. "Everything else will teach you." He nodded toward the hollow, toward the seam of new stone she'd already noticed without knowing what it meant yet. "There's a wall in there with 6 names on it. Before you graduate, somebody's going to tell you the whole story of why. For now, all you need to know is that this academy learned the hard way that the loudest cadet in the room isn't usually the one worth listening to first. Keep your eyes open, keep your mouth shut until you've got something worth saying, and you'll do fine here." She nodded, some of the tension easing out of her shoulders, and fell in with the rest of the new intake as Corps began walking them through the receiving yard briefing, and Rehin watched her go with the specific, quiet satisfaction of a man who recognized, in the wary set of a stranger's shoulders, an old and familiar shape of his own arrival, and who now had something useful to offer that arrival that nobody had thought to offer him. Warden 6 found him afterward, the way it often did on quiet afternoons now, ambling loose and unhurried across the training yard from the annex where Corps kept her active roster, and settled its massive wedge-shaped head against Rehin's shoulder with a familiarity that had taken 8 months to build and would, he suspected, take the rest of his posting at this academy to fully understand. It didn't need to hunt anymore, not in the way the old trials had once demanded of it, and something in its posture these days, head lowered, forelimbs relaxed, the low grinding sound it made now less like mourning and more like simple, settled contentment, told Rehin the beast had finally been allowed to remember what 4 centuries of careful breeding had actually built it to be. He rested a hand against its ridged flank, feeling the slow, steady pulse of it under his palm, the same patient rhythm he'd once pressed his ear to a crack in the arena floor to hear, and thought, not for the first time, that the whole strange arc of the last cycle had come down to exactly this. Not a fight won, not a beast defeated, but 2 very different kinds of listening finally recognizing each other for what they'd always been. "You did good today," he told it, quiet, the words meaning nothing to a creature that understood scent and vibration far better than language, and meaning, somehow, everything at once. The warden made its low, grinding sound again, settled its weight more fully against him, and did not move for a long while, and Rehin stood there in the cooling evening light of a training yard that had once nearly buried a boy nobody had thought to look for, and let himself, finally, simply rest. Her name was Wren Ashford, and she washed out of her first listening trial assessment 2 weeks into the cycle, badly enough that she spent the evening after sitting alone on the low wall outside the rescue annex, refusing the mess hall, refusing company, staring at the darkening courtyard with the particular flat misery of a 17-year-old convinced she'd just proven every doubt anyone back home had ever quietly harbored about her. Rehin found her there on his way back from the annex, and didn't sit down right away, just stood at a respectful distance with his hands in his pockets, giving her the choice of whether this became a conversation or stayed a silence. "I froze," she said eventually, not looking at him. "Simulated collapse, nothing even real, and I froze so bad Handler Corps had to call the drill off before I hurt myself walking into a support strut I should have seen coming. 3 humans in this whole cohort, and I'm the one who can't even pass a fake rescue." "You didn't freeze," Rehin said. "I watched the readout. You stopped moving for 4 seconds because your body told you something was wrong with the strut before your mind had caught up enough to explain why, and you didn't trust it yet. That's not failure. That's the exact instinct this whole program is built to teach, showing up 11 months early and without any training behind it yet. Feels like failure from inside it. Most useful things do, the first few times," Rehin said, and this time he did sit, easing down onto the wall a careful arm's length away, giving her the space to close the distance herself if she wanted it. "I spent my first real collapse site back on Earth so certain I was about to get somebody killed that I couldn't make myself move for almost 10 full seconds, standing right at the entrance with people screaming behind a wall of rubble I hadn't even started clearing yet. My team lead at the time didn't tell me I'd failed. She told me the 10 seconds I spent listening instead of charging in blind was the only reason I heard which direction the voices were actually coming from, because the layout on our maps was wrong and the fast, confident cadet standing next to me had already started digging in exactly the wrong spot." Wren looked at him properly for the first time since he'd sat down. "You froze too." "Everybody who's any good at this freezes," Rehin said. "The ones who don't are usually the ones you don't want anywhere near a real collapse, because confidence without listening gets people killed just as fast as panic does. The skill isn't never freezing. It's learning what your own 4 seconds of freezing is actually telling you, and trusting it enough to act on what you hear once it's done talking." She was quiet for a while, turning that over, some of the flat misery in her shoulders easing into something more like thought. "Corps rerunning the assessment in 3 days. I know I asked her to." You asked her to give me a second chance. I asked her to give you the same chance every cadet in this program gets now, which is more than one shot at learning something that used to get people killed the first time they got it wrong here. Rehin looked out at the darkening courtyard, the same blue-gray evening light he remembered from his own first difficult weeks, a lifetime and one very long day in the dark ago. There's a boy in the third-year cohort, smallest cadet this academy's had in a generation, spent his first 3 years here getting called half-shell by cadets twice his size because he didn't harden up on schedule. He's the best junior handler this program's produced yet, because the same instinct that made him small and careful and easy to overlook turned out to be exactly the instinct that hears a trapped voice under solid granite before anybody bigger and louder even thinks to listen for it. You don't know yet what your own version of that's going to turn out to be. Give it more than one bad drill to show you. 3 days later, Wren Ashford ran the reassessment with her jaw set and her hands steady, and when the simulated structure groaned in a way that told her, 4 seconds in, that something about the support geometry was wrong, she didn't freeze this time. She stopped, called it out clear and flat the way the protocol trained every cadet to, and Handler Corps, watching from the annex control station with Rehin and Sol beside her, marked the halt as a correct read before the drill's own hazard timeline had even reached the point where it would have mattered. She's going to be good at this, Corps said, quiet, watching the girl work her way through the rest of the assessment with a careful, deliberate patience that had nothing left in it of the frozen misery from 3 nights earlier. She already is, Rehin said. She just needed somebody to tell her that freezing long enough to listen was never the failure everybody back home taught her it was. Sol, standing at Cor's other shoulder, made a small, dry sound that on a human might have passed for a laugh. Funny. Somebody told me almost exactly the same thing, about a year ago, at the bottom of a hole I was very sure I wasn't getting out of. Funny how that keeps working out, Rehin said, and watched Wren Ashford clear the last simulated hazard of her assessment with 4 seconds of careful, deliberate stillness, at exactly the moment it mattered most, and felt, standing in the annex control room with the 2 people who understood best what that kind of stillness had once cost and saved, something settle in his chest that had been unsettled in one form or another for a very long time. Karras retired from active proctor duty the following spring, not from any failing of health or nerve, but because, as he told Rehin over the last of the bitter academy tea in his office, the walls stripped bare of 19 years of Proctor's citations and half-packed into transport crates. He had decided a man who had spent 19 years being trained not to question authority had no business spending the rest of his career training the next generation to do the same. He took a seat on the Regional Oversight Council instead, the same chamber that had once nearly stripped Threndel Academy of its reforms, and Rehin understood, watching him go, that the old proctor intended to spend whatever years he had left making very sure no academy under that council's watch ever again found it easier to pour new concrete over the truth than to say it out loud the first time it mattered. "You'll do well there," Rehin told him, the morning the transport came to collect the last of his crates. "I will do what I should have done 19 years ago," Karras said. "Which is considerably less impressive than doing well, but it is the debt I actually owe, and I have found that paying an old debt honestly is worth more than earning a new reputation cheaply." He studied Rehin a moment, 4 black eyes carrying something that, on a face built for a different set of expressions than a human's, had come to read to Rehin, over 2 full cycles, as something very close to fondness. "You could have left this academy the day your ribs healed, Voss. Gone home with a citation and a story worth telling for the rest of your life. Instead you stayed and rebuilt half this academy's doctrine from the ground up and taught a hatchling nobody else believed in how to save people for a living, and I have never once asked you why, because I suspected the answer would embarrass you more than it would satisfy my curiosity." "Probably would have," Rehin agreed. "Then I will simply say this instead of asking it," Karras said, and there was nothing flat about his voice at all now, 19 years of grinding stone cadence finally worn down to something plain and true. This academy is better for the fact that you refused an order you had every reason to follow, on the strength of nothing but your own hand pressed against a floor everyone else had stopped listening to. I do not know what your species calls that particular kind of stubbornness. On this world, we have started calling it the listening trial, and I intend to make sure it outlives both of us. He offered his hand, the same borrowed human gesture Dreeth had once used, and this time it didn't feel stiff or unfamiliar at all. Just two people who had pulled each other, in their own separate ways, out of a very deep hole, shaking on the fact that neither of them intended to let it close again. Priya took a permanent instructional posting alongside Rihan that same season, having decided somewhere over the previous cycle that the exchange program's original 2-year rotation wasn't nearly long enough to finish the work they'd started, and the two of them settled into the particular easy, undemonstrative rhythm of people who trusted each other completely, and had never once needed to make more of it than that. Dreeth Call graduated at the top of his cohort in the rescue program, formally requested, and received a permanent transfer under Handler Corps' command, and spent his first full season as a licensed handler working the same tunnel systems that had once nearly claimed 6 laborers, pulling 3 more out alive before the cycle was through, quiet about it every time, the way a man is quiet about something he still doesn't fully believe he's earned the right to be proud of. Sol Tar, Cadet Tar no longer, Instructor Tar now, the youngest handler instructor in the Academy's 3-century history, took over the first-year orientation lecture the following intake, and the story he told the newest cadets, standing at the edge of the hollow with the pale seam of patched granite behind him, was not the story of a human who had broken an order to save him. It was the story of a beast nobody had bothered to properly listen to for 40 years, and what an institution owed the things it had trained to serve it honestly. Warden 6 lived out the rest of its long, patient life in Corps' program, and its final litter sired late, in the unhurried way of a creature that had finally been given the time to simply exist instead of merely perform, produced 4 pups the rescue program raised from birth on nothing but tracking drills and gentle handling, never once taught the old combat conditioning, never once asked to be anything other than exactly what 4 centuries of careful breeding had built them to be. Corps named the smallest of the litter after the boy who'd first taught her, in a season she still called the hardest and best of her long career, that an old handler could still learn something new about the animals she thought she already understood completely. Rihan stayed at Threndel Academy for the rest of his career, instructing cohort after cohort in the specific, unglamorous discipline of listening to a structure before trusting it, of trusting a beast's instincts over a manual's assumptions, of calling a halt without shame the moment something felt wrong, no rank deference required. He never became famous the way the 9-minute clip had briefly threatened to make him. The galaxy's attention moved on, the way it always did, to newer footage and louder stories, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he preferred it that way. The work that actually mattered had never needed an audience. It had only ever needed one person willing to put a hand against the floor and believe what it told him, long enough for everyone else to learn how to listen too. Wren Ashford graduated at the end of her cohort's 3rd year with a handler's insignia of her own, the second human in the program's short history to earn one, and asked Rihan, the evening before her own transfer orders came through, why he'd never once tried to explain to her exactly how he'd known, on that very first difficult night, that her 4 seconds of stillness hadn't been failure at all. Because explaining it wouldn't have taught you anything, Rihan said. You had to feel the difference yourself between freezing because you're scared and freezing because some part of you already knows something the rest of you hasn't caught up to yet. Words don't teach that. Time does, if you let it. That's a very patient way of saying you didn't have a better answer ready, she said, and he laughed, because she wasn't wrong. And because 11 months on this academy had taught him that the cadets worth keeping were always the ones sharp enough to catch him at it. She shipped out 3 days later to a border posting not unlike the one she'd been recruited from, and sent back, over the following seasons, the occasional short message routed through the same relay Rehin used for his own letters home. A rescue completed, a stubborn cadet talked through her own version of the same 4 seconds Ren had once needed talking through herself. He kept every one of them, the way he suspected Karas kept the 6 names in the chapel hall, not out of any formal duty to remember, but because some debts were worth carrying lightly for as long as a life lasted, and this particular one had never once felt heavy. On quiet evenings, when the training yards had emptied, and the hollow sat dark and still under its high glass ceiling, Rehin sometimes walked the short distance from the instructional quarters to the chapel hall where 6 names waited in their alcoves, and stood there a while, not out of duty, not anymore, but because some visits stopped being obligations once enough time had passed and simply became a way of keeping faith with the dead. He carried the small polished disc Karas had given him on a cord under his collar, worn smooth now from 2 full cycles of quiet handling, and on those evenings he would sometimes take it out and turn it once between his fingers before tucking it away again, a small, private ritual that belonged to no one but himself. The last thing he always did, before heading back to his quarters for the night, was cross to the arena's edge and press one palm flat against the cool granite of the northeast quadrant, over the seam of paler stone that marked where a floor had once cracked open, and told the truth to the one person in the whole arena who had finally thought to listen for it. The ground never lied. It just waited for somebody willing to put their hand down and hear what it had been trying to say the whole time. That Rehin had come to understand was the only lesson this academy, or any academy on any world under any sky, had ever really needed to teach.